Let the day go now. Let it slide away from you the way the light slides off a hillside at the close of a long afternoon, unhurried and then all at once and without any sound at all, and let the doors of it swing softly shut behind you one after another. For I have a long and gentle story to tell you tonight, a true one, a documented one, a thing that truly happened to real people in a real place. And it is a story I mean to tell you the way the oldest and kindest stories have always been best told, which is low and slow and close to a small warm fire, by someone who wishes you nothing in all the world but rest, and asks nothing of you at all except that you lie still, and breathe, and let the words come in over you the way the quiet water comes in over a shore, without haste, without alarm, taking their own long and patient time. You may sleep whenever you like tonight, whenever your own eyes decide the matter for you and close of their own soft weight. You may let them, and you will lose nothing by it, for there is nothing in this whole night that you must stay awake to catch, nothing that will startle you, no sudden turn waiting in the dark to reach out and take hold of your heart, and no ending that I will not have laid down gently before you, out in the open, long before we ever arrive at it. In fact, I am going to tell you the ending now, at the very beginning, and I am going to tell it to you more than once as we go, so that your heart may be at peace the whole way through and never once be made to hold its breath and wait. That is a promise, and it is the first of the small promises I will make you tonight, and you may lean your whole weight upon it, the way you would lean upon a wall you have already tested with your hand. So let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has driven them, down, and then a little further than that, because there is nearly always a little further to go, some small held thing in the tops of the shoulders that has been waiting all day long for permission to let go. And here now is the permission. Let whatever is holding you take your weight completely, the bed or the chair or the pillow, whatever it is, let it hold you fully, so that not one muscle of you is still doing the work of keeping you upright, for that work is finished for today, and you may hand it over now, all of it. Let the small hinge of the jaw come unclenched. Let the space between your brows go soft and wide and smooth, and let your breath find its own slow way down into something longer and easier, all on its own, without you standing over it and minding it, just letting it lengthen the way the tide lengthens as it turns. There, that is all you have to do tonight. There is no test in the morning. You truly cannot miss a thing. Now stay with me a little while yet if you can before the sleep takes you, because there is a place I want to bring you to, a real place, and I want to bring you to it the way it ought first to be seen, which is at the soft blue end of a summer day, in the high green upland of the far north of Wales. So come with me back through the years and away over the miles, to a country of rounded, treeless mountains, of long bare slopes cropped close by sheep and turning from green to russet brown as they climb, of high wet moorland lying under a wide and changing sky, a place folk have loved and worked and buried their people in for longer than any of us can properly hold in the mind. We are in the old county of Merionethshire, in a valley called Tryweryn, not far from the little market town of Bala and the long grey lake that lies beside it, up where the young rivers gather off the peat and come down cold and clear through the folds of the hills. And I am going to set you down, gently, on the shore of a wide and quiet sheet of water. It lies in a broad bowl of those rounded mountains, a long pale mirror of a lake held in the arms of the high ground, the bare moorland peaks standing all around it on the skyline, and a low grey wall of concrete closing off one end of it where the valley narrows. The evening is coming on as we stand here. The light along the mountain horizon has gone to a soft violet and a fading amber, that long slow afterglow you only get in high country, and a pale blue-grey mist is beginning to lie down upon the water, and the whole scene is quiet and still and unbearably peaceful. And if you did not know, you would think it had always been exactly this, and only this, a beautiful empty upland lake, doing nothing but holding the last of the light. But look there, a little way up from the water, close by the mountain road that runs along the side of the valley. There is a small building of neat grey Welsh stone, newer than the hills but built to belong to them. A modest little chapel with a low-arched gateway, standing above the lake and looking out over it. And if you were to go inside, out of the wind, you would find set into its walls a number of engraved stone plaques, and cut into that stone the names of houses, and the names of the families who lived in those houses. And you would understand, standing there in the quiet, that this small chapel above the water is not a chapel for a village that stands nearby. It is a chapel that remembers a village that is gone. For under that wide and lovely lake, under the pale mirror and the blue-grey mist, down beneath the still water where the light cannot reach, there is a valley floor, and on that valley floor there are the walls of farmhouses, and the shape of small green fields, and a stone bridge, and a one-room school, and a little grey chapel of its own with a small bell in its gable, and there was, not so very long ago, a living village down there, with people in it, and smoke going up from its chimneys, and children in its lane. Its name was Capel Celyn. And here is the ending of the story, told plainly and told early, the way I promised you it would be. Capel Celyn was a small village, no more than a dozen farms and houses, and a scattering of some 4 dozen souls, tucked up at the top of the Tryweryn Valley, and it was, almost uniquely by the middle of the last century, a place where the whole of life ran in the Welsh language, and in no other, where the chapel worshipped in Welsh, and the school taught in Welsh, and the children played, and the old people prayed, and the farmers called their dogs across the hillside, all in the old tongue, one of the last unbroken pockets of it, left anywhere. And in the 1950s, the great English city of Liverpool, far away to the north and east, wanted water. More water. Always more water. For its houses and its factories and its growing millions of people. And its engineers looked at this remote Welsh valley and saw not a village and not a language and not a way of life, but a convenient bowl in the hills that could be dammed at one end and filled up into a reservoir. And so, over the objection of the people who lived there, and over the near total objection of Wales itself, the valley was condemned to be drowned. The village of Capel Celyn was emptied out. Its people were moved away, house by house and family by family. Its dead were lifted from the churchyard and carried up to higher ground. And then the great dam was closed, and the water began to rise, slowly up over the meadows and the dry stone walls and the doorsteps and the school and the chapel, until in the year 1965 the lake stood full, and the village was gone beneath it, and the whole valley of Tryweryn lay drowned to make a reservoir for a city that never once thought to ask the people whose home it was. That is the sorrow at the heart of tonight, and I am not going to hide it from you or dress it up as anything softer than it was, for it was a hard thing, and a wrong thing, and the people it was done to knew that it was wrong, and did everything that lawful and peaceful and decent people could possibly do to prevent it, and were overruled anyway by others who did not live there and would never have to watch it happen. We will walk through all of that, in its time, slowly and gently, so that you understand it, and so that it is honoured. But I told you I would give you the ending, the whole of it, before we ever set out, so that your heart could rest, and the sorrow is only the first half of the ending, and it is not the half I want to leave in your hands as you fall asleep. Here is the rest of it. The village was drowned, but the village was not erased. It turns out to be a very hard thing, harder than any city engineer imagined, to make a place truly disappear once people have loved it. When the water closed over Capel Celyn, it did something that no one had planned, and no one had wanted, and no one could afterward undo. It woke a whole nation up to itself. The quiet, patient, dignified loss of this one small Welsh-speaking valley became a thing that Wales could not stop thinking about. A grief that would not settle, and out of that grief came a slow turning, a strengthening, a national remembering that runs on to this very day, so that the valley, in the act of going under, changed the country that had let it go under. and in a way that no one can take back. And the people did not let the pieces of their village sink and be forgotten. Either before the water came, they carried the important things up out of the valley to safety. Up to the high ground above the future lake, they took the little bell down out of the chapel gable. And they took the pulpit the preacher had stood in, and they gathered the stone and the names. And they built that small grey memorial chapel you are looking at now, up above the waterline, by the road, and they set the bell and the pulpit and the names inside it, and there they are kept to this day, tended and cared for and visited. And far off, on a lonely stretch of coast on the other side of Wales, someone took a brush and some dull red paint, and wrote 2 words across a low ruined wall by the roadside. 2 words in Welsh, and those 2 words have been repainted and guarded and defended for more than half a century since, and have become a landmark that the whole country knows. Cofoch Drywarin, remember Trywarin, and there is one thing more, the gentlest thing of all, and I will give it to you now and give it back to you again at the very end. The lake does not always keep the village hidden. In the dry summers, when the rains hold off and the reservoir sinks low, the water pulls back off the valley floor, and Capel Celyn comes up again into the light. The old stone bridge lifts back out of the shrinking water, and the low-field walls reappear running down the drying mud, and the pale foundation lines of the chapel and the cottages rise up once more into the warm level sun. And people come and walk down over the cracked bed of the lake, and stand among the walls of the drowned village, in the daylight, on the very ground where it stood. So the village is drowned, but it is not gone. It comes back. It comes back whenever the water grows thin enough to let it, and it is remembered every single day, whether it comes back or not. And that is the true shape of the ending I want you to carry down into sleep tonight. Not a thing destroyed, but a thing taken and lost and grieved, and, in the deepest sense, kept. And let me say one thing more about the manner of the telling, because it matters, and because it is the second small promise I will make you tonight, and you should have it before we go on. This is a true story, as I said, and a well-remembered one. It happened close enough to our own time that there are people living yet who were children in that valley, who sat at those little desks and heard that bell, and there are photographs of the village as it stood, and the letters and the newspapers and the very words spoken in the great Parliament far away are all written down and kept, so that most of what I will tell you tonight rests on solid and honest ground, and I can give it to you plainly. But a story like this gathers a little softness at its edges over the years, the way any beloved and much-told thing does, and here and there the exact number of a thing, or the precise word of a thing, has come down to us in more than one form, and where that is so, I will not pretend to a sharpness I do not have. I will tell you honestly when a thing is well known, and when it is only well loved, for there is no need, in a story whose whole heart is the keeping of the truth of a place, to gild any part of it. The plain facts are heavy enough, and true enough, and they will hold your full weight, and mine, all the way through. Now, because we have a long and quiet way to travel together through this night, and because I want you to be able to let go of the thread of it whenever sleep reaches for you and still hold the heart of it safe, let me give you 3 small things to keep. I do this every night, you will remember if you have been here before. I gather up the few warm stones from the middle of the story, the things worth holding, and I name them plainly at the start, and I set them in your hand, so that even if you drift away in the deep middle hours and lose all the rest of the words, these 3 will still be there in your palm when you wake, warm and smooth and whole. Here is the first stone. The bell. There was a little bell in the gable of the chapel at Capel Celyn, a small old thing of green-brown bronze that rang out over the valley on a Sunday morning and called the people down off the farms to worship, and rang too, for the weddings and the funerals and all the ordinary Sundays in between, and when the valley was condemned. That bell was not left to drown. It was taken down and carried up out of the valley and kept, and it hangs to this day in the memorial chapel above the water, saved so that is the first stone you will carry tonight, the bell taken safely up out of the flood. Hold it. Here is the second stone. The slates. Down in that valley there was a school, one single room, with rows of small worn wooden desks and a cast iron stove, and a row of low pegs along the wall for the children's coats. And the children who sat at those desks wrote their letters and their sums on little slate boards with chalk. In Welsh, their own language, the small Welsh names of them chalked up on the wall and read aloud in the register of a morning. Those children, and their slates, and their names, are the second thing I want you to keep. The small slates and the small names in the one-room school. Hold that too. And here is the third stone, the one that has outlasted all the rest and stands guard over the whole memory to this day. The 2 words. Cofitch Drywarin. Remember Trywarin, 2 words of dull red paint on a broken wall a long way off that a whole country chose not to let fade. Those are your 3 warm stones for the night. The bell, the slates, and the 2 words. The bell that was saved from the water. The slates and the names of the children. And the 2 words that keep the watch. You need do nothing with them but hold them. I will carry all the rest. Before we go any further down into the story, let me do the thing I always like to do at the start, which is simply to think for a moment of you, out there, wherever you are, listening. For you are not, I think, in only one place. You are scattered, all of you who come to sit by this fire, scattered across the dark of the whole turning world, and I like to picture you there. Some of you are in a city tonight, high up in a room with the traffic gone soft and far below the window, the sky over the rooftops that strange orange that a city sky never quite loses. Some of you are out in deep country, with the whole dark land breathing around the house and not another light for miles. Some of you are hearing rain against the glass, that steady patient rain that is one of the kindest sounds there is to fall asleep inside of, and some of you are in a still warm night where nothing moves at all and will not move until the dawn. Some of you are wide awake and hoping not to be for long. Some of you have heard this far already through half-closed eyes. Some of you come here every single night, old friends I will never see, and some of you have found this fire for the very first time tonight, and to every last one of you, near and far, old and new, weary or restless, or simply wanting a little company in the dark, I say the same thing, and I mean it as plainly and as warmly as I know how. You are welcome here, and this hour belongs to you, and I am glad, honestly glad, that you came. And if you like, when you have a moment, in the quiet, you might tell me where you are listening from tonight, what country, what kind of night it is outside your window. For I do like to know who has gathered round. Though there is no need, and no hurry, and you may just as well say nothing at all and simply rest, which is after all the whole reason you came. And let me tell you plainly too, so you may put it right out of your mind, that there is nothing frightening waiting for you anywhere in this story. This is not that kind of tale, and I am not that kind of teller. There will be no horror in it, no cruelty dwelt upon, nothing sharp that leaps out at you from the dark. What there is sadness. Yes, a long and quiet and honest sadness, the kind that any true story of a lost and lovely place must carry, but it is a gentle sadness, a kind sadness, the sort you can hold in cupped hands and look at calmly, and I promise you that I will carry it all the way through to peace, every step of the way, and that we will come out at the far end of it, hours from now, into the quiet, and the light on the water, and the keeping of the names, and rest. You will not be left anywhere hard. I give you my word on that, and you may lean on it too. So that is the whole of the ending, given to you early, as promised, a valley taken and drowned and grieved, and a valley, in its drowning, but woke a nation, and was carried up out of the flood in a bell and a pulpit and a wall of names, and is remembered still, and rises up again into the light in the dry summers to be walked among, and 3 warm stones to keep, the bell, the slates, the 2 words. You have everything now that your heart needs in order to rest. There is nothing left to dread and nothing left to wait for, and that means we are free, you and I, to do the only thing worth doing with a story like this one, which is to go back, all the way back, slowly and without any hurry at all, and take the long way round and come to know the valley of Tryweryn and the little village of Capel not as a thing that was lost, but as a thing that lived. For you cannot rightly feel the weight of what was taken until you have first seen, with your own inward eye, all that there was to take. So that is where we are going first in the chapter to come. We are going to leave the still evening lake behind us for a while and go back before the water, before the dam, before the very idea of a reservoir had entered any engineer's head, back to the bare and beautiful shape of the land itself as it lay under the open sky, and we are going to walk down off the high moorland into the green fold of the valley and understand what kind of place this was, and why of all the valleys in Wales, the loss of this particular one would come to matter so much to so many. But none of that is anything you need reach for now. For now it is enough to have set the whole of the story down gently between us, where we can both still see it, and to have stood together a moment on the shore of the quiet lake in the last of the violet light, with the mist coming down soft upon the water, and the little grey chapel keeping its patient watch above. Let your breath go long and slow, let the pale water lie still behind your closed eyes, and come with me now, unhurried, back before the flood, to the valley as it was. So let us go back then, and let us go the long way round to it, the slow way, the way you come to a high place on foot rather than all at once, because a valley like this one is not truly a thing you can understand by being set down in the middle of it. You have to come to it over the tops first, the way the weather comes to it, the way the rivers come to it, the way the old people came to it century upon century before there was any road worth the name, and so before we ever meet the village, before we so much as see a chimney or hear a bell, I want to take you up above it all, up onto the bare shoulder of the land itself, and let you stand a while in the wind and simply look at the shape of the ground, for the ground is the oldest thing in this story, and it was here long before the sorrow, and it is here still now under the water, holding the same shape it always held, and it will help you to know it. Come up then, onto the high moor that lies above the valley, the great wet upland they call the Mignion, and say that name softly to yourself as we go, Mignant, the place of the bog, the place of the wet ground, for that is exactly and honestly what it is. A vast rolling waste of peat and heather and rushes lying across the roof of that part of North Wales, brown and russet and soft gold under a wide grey sky, with the wind never quite still upon it, and the cotton grass nodding its little white, heads all across the dark ground, and pools of black peaty water lying in the hollows catching the last of the light. It is a lonely place, the Mignant, and a beautiful one, and it is high, and it is cold, and it holds the rain the way a sponge holds water, all the long soft weeping rain that comes in off the western sea and breaks against these hills and falls, and every drop of it that falls upon that high moor has to go somewhere, and where it goes is down, always down, gathering and trickling and seeping out of the black peat in 1,000 tiny threads no wider than your finger, threads that run together into rills, and rills that run together into streams, and streams that come sliding and chuckling off the shoulder of the moor, and down into the head of a long green fold in the mountains, and there they gather themselves at last into a single young river. And the river has a name, and the name is the Afon Tryweryn. Hold that name too, gently, the way you would hold a small cold stone in your palm to warm it. The Afon Tryweryn, the Tryweryn River, for it is the true beginning of everything. The river that made the fold and fed the meadows and turned the little mills and gave the valley its water without fail through every dry year and every hard year. And it is the river, in the end, that they would dam. But she is only young here at her beginning, the Tryweryn, only a bright quick mountain stream running clear and cold and shallow over grey stones, brown with the peat when the rain has been heavy and clear as glass when it has not, and she runs down out of the high wet ground and into the green. And as she runs, the mountains rise up on either side of her and make a valley of her going. And it is that valley, the Tryweryn Valley, the fold that the young river cut for herself out of the hills, that we have come all this way to see. Look at the shape of it now with me. These are not the sharp black mountains of the picture postcards, not the jagged peaks that tear the cloud. These are the rounder, older, gentler mountains of this middle country of Wales. Great smooth green whale-backed hills lying shoulder to shoulder along the sky, treeless nearly to the very tops. Their slopes are patchwork of sheep-cropped grass gone every shade from soft spring green to the deep russet brown of the dead winter bracken, with here and there the pale grey bones of the rock breaking through the turf, and the bare moorland summits standing along the skyline in a long slow rolling line, and over it all, morning and evening, that particular soft violet and amber light that gathers along a Welsh mountain horizon at the turn of the day, when the low sun lies down along the peaks and the blue-grey shadow comes creeping up out of the valleys, and the whole world goes still and luminous and kind. Down the middle of it all runs the fold, the valley floor, a narrow ribbon of the greenest and best land, level enough in places to make a meadow of, and through the green ribbon runs the young river bright and busy, and up out of the river the land climbs away on either hand, first the enclosed fields with their walls, then the open mountain, then the moor, then the sky. That is the whole of it. That is the shape of the ground. And now that you can see the shape of it, let me count for you, slowly, the plain good gifts that such ground gives to the people who live upon it. Because they are simple gifts, and they are the same gifts these hills have been giving for 1,000 years, and it is worth naming them one by one the way you might name your blessings before you sleep. The first gift is the water, and I have told you of it already, but I will tell you again because it matters. The water that never fails, the bright cold river and the 1,000 little streams coming off the moor, so that no farm in that valley was ever more than a short walk from running water sweet enough to drink, water for the house and water for the beasts, and water for the little mill wheels. Water in the wet years and water in the dry, water without fail, which is the first and oldest wealth of any upland place, and the one thing above all others that the men from the distant city would one day come to take. The second gift is the grass, the sweet short upland pasture that grows thin and fine and hardy on those high slopes, poor-looking grass to a stranger's eye, nothing lush about it, but grass that suits perfectly the small tough mountain sheep that have grazed these hills since before anyone thought to write anything down. The little hardy ewes that can find a living on ground where a soft lowland animal would starve, that know their own patch of mountain by heart and pass the knowing of it down from mother to lamb. And it is the sheep, more than anything, that the valley lived by, the sheep on the open hill, and the sheep in the walled fields, and the sheep whose wool and whose lambs were nearly the whole of thee. Money that ever came up that valley from the world outside. The third gift is the shelter, the fold itself, the way the great round hills lean in close on either side, and make of the valley floor a sheltered green trough down in the lee of the wind, so that where the moor above is raw and open and cruel with weather, the valley bottom is soft and still and kind. Warm enough in a good summer to ripen a hay crop, sheltered enough in a hard winter to keep the beasts alive, a fold in every sense of that good old word, a fold that folds you in and keeps you. And the fourth gift, growing out of the third, is the hay, the flat sweet meadows along the level valley floor by the river, the one part of all that steep hard country where the ground lay kind enough to cut, and those meadows were the treasure of the place, saved and tended and watched over all through the growing season, for it was the hay off those valley meadows, gathered in through the long light days of a Welsh July, that fed the beasts through the dark of the year, and so kept the whole community alive from one spring to the next. Lose your hay to a wet summer, and you were in trouble, and everyone knew it, and so the meadows on the valley floor, the flattest and greenest and most precious ground of all, were the very heart of the farming life. And I ask you to remember that the best and most loved ground of all was the low ground by the river, because it is the low ground by the river that the water would take first and take deepest. And there was one more thing that ran through the valley, one thing that was not a gift of nature, but a gift of men. And it was the old road, the drover's road, the ancient hard-trodden way that came threading down through that upland country, carrying the great herds and flocks to market. For you must understand that this middle country of Wales, though it seems the very picture of a place at the end of the world, was for centuries a place that things passed through, and what passed through it was livestock. Cattle and sheep and even geese driven on the hoof in their thousands, gathered off the Welsh hills by the hard brown weathered men they called the drovers, and walked, all the long slow weeks eastward over the mountains and across the border and down into England to be sold in the great English markets and to feed the great English cities. And one of the old ways they walked ran through this very valley, so that even here, even in this remote green fold at the head of a mountain river, there was a thread that ran all the way to England and to English money and English hunger, a thread that had always run one way, the valley's goods sent out over the hills to feed the far-off town. Hold that thought too, quietly, for later. But for now feel only how it deepens the rootedness of the place, how many hundreds of years of feet had worn that road, how old the coming and going was, how the valley, for all its remoteness, was never quite cut off, only far, only high, only apart. And apart is the word I want to leave with you above all others about the shape of this land. Apart, set apart. A place you had to mean to go to, a remote and self-sufficing Welsh hill community, lying far up a single valley at the end of a single road, needing very little from the world beyond the ridge, and getting very little from it. A place that grew its own food, and cut its own fuel, and raised its own children, and buried its own dead, and kept its own counsel, and asked nothing of anyone, a small whole world entire unto itself, folded down in its green trough between the great round hills, with a young river running through it, quiet and hardy and content and old. And when at last you have stood up there long enough on the high shoulder of the moor, and watched the light go violet along the peaks, and followed the young river down with your eye into the green, and felt in your bones how far this fold lies from anywhere, then you are ready to be told the name of the place, and it is a small plain name and a beautiful one, and it is Capel Celyn. Say it softly. Capel Celyn. The first word Capel is easy enough and you will half know it already, for it is only the Welsh for chapel, the same chapel that the English word came from, a plain little word for a plain little building, and it tells you at once the thing that stood at the centre of the place and the thing the place was named for. Not a castle, not a manor, not a great church, but a chapel, a small humble meeting house of the plainest kind, and we shall come to it and to all it meant in its own good time. And the second word, Celyn, that is the word I want you to keep, for Celyn is the Welsh for holly, the holly tree, the dark bright evergreen with the glossy spiked leaves and the red berries that we all know, and so the name of the whole village, the name of that entire drowned world, means simply and only this, the chapel of the holly, Capel Celyn, the chapel of the holly tree. And is that not a good name to carry with you into the dark tonight? And is there not a strange soft comfort folded up inside it? For think what the holly is. Think what the holly does. The holly is the tree that keeps its green through the winter, the tree that does not die back and does not go bare, the one hard, bright, living green thing in the grey dead heart of the year, the tree the old people cut and brought indoors at the very darkest turning of the winter, precisely because it would not surrender its life, because it stayed green and glossy and alive when everything else had gone brown and bare and seemingly dead. A small stubborn evergreen promised that the life was only sleeping and would come again. And so this village that was going to be drowned, this village that was going to be taken and lost and covered over by the cold rising water, this village carried in its very name, from the beginning and by no design of anyone's, the emblem of the thing that does not die in winter, the green that keeps through the cold, the life that is covered over but not ended and comes back into the light again, and I do not think you need me to draw the line for you between the holly that keeps its green through the dark of the year and a drowned village that keeps rising up out of the summer water still, so I will only set the two of them side by side, gently, and leave them there together, the holly and the village that was named for it, and let you feel the rhyme of it in your own quiet heart. Now this valley, this apart and self-sufficing place, was old in its human story, far older than you might think to look at so small and simple a spot, and I want to give you just one thing out of its deep past before we come down into the years of the village itself, one old buried root of the place, because it tells you something true about the kind of people these were and the kind of ground this was. Go back with me then past the time of anyone we shall meet, back past their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents, back 300 years and more, to the raw and troubled middle of the 1600s, when all across Britain there was a great deep stirring in the matter of how a soul might rightly come to God, and out of that stirring, in the wild lonely uplands of just this part of Wales, there rose up one of the earliest gatherings of the people the world would come to call the Quakers, the Society of Friends, those quiet radical souls who held that no priest and no bishop and no grand building stood between a person and their Maker, that the light of God was in every one of them directly, and who therefore would not bow and would not conform, and would not pay their tithes to a church they could not believe in, and who were for all this hunted and fined and gaoled and driven. And this high remote valley country was one of the cradles of them, one of the first places in all of Wales where the Friends met and worshipped, up here in the folds of these very hills, gathering in secret in the farm kitchens and out on the open mountain, far from the eyes of the authorities that would have punished them, drawn to this ground exactly because it was so remote and so apart and so hard to reach, because a place at the end of a single valley is a place where quiet people can meet quietly and be left alone. And when in the end even this high country grew too dangerous for them, when the hunting and the fining pressed too hard, a great many of those early Welsh friends did the only thing left to them, which was to leave, to give up the very hills that had sheltered them and cross the whole wide grey ocean to the new land beyond it, to Pennsylvania, to the tract of ground that William Penn set aside there for the Welsh tract as they called it, where they might at last worship freely and speak their own tongue and be let alone. And they took the names of their lost valleys with them across the sea and laid those names down again on the new ground, so that to this day there are places in Pennsylvania that carry the old Welsh names of the hills these people left. And I tell you this old story, this 300-year-old story of the Friends and their leaving, not because any of those particular people are in the tale we are telling tonight, for they are long gone and long overseas, but because of the shape of it, because of what it says. For do you not hear it? Do you not hear the note already sounding, faint and far off and long ago, the very same note that the whole of tonight's story will sound again at its full and terrible weight, that this gentle valley had already once before given its own people up to exile, had already once been a place from which the quiet and the faithful were made to leave and go far away to live under a distant sky, so that when the second and final leaving came, leaving under the water, it was not the first time these hills had watched their children carry their names away over the horizon and not come back. The ground remembered how to lose its people. It had done it gently once, long ago. Hold that too. But now I come to the last thing about this valley, and it is the greatest thing. The thing that makes this fold in the hills unlike any English valley you could name, unlike any green trough in any other country. The one thing that raised what happened here from a sad local matter of moved farms into a wound in the heart of a whole people, and it is a thing you cannot see from the high moor and cannot read in the shape of the ground at all. For it is not a thing of stone or water or grass, it is a thing of the air, a thing of the breath, a thing of the human mouth and the human ear. It is the language, for Capel was Welsh, wholly and utterly and unbrokenly Welsh, in a way that is very hard to say strongly enough to a listener who has not known such a place. Welsh not as a flag is Welsh, or a rugby match is Welsh, but Welsh in its every waking word, Welsh in the deepest daily grain of it, one of the last handful of places left in all the world with the old tongue of the island of Britain. The language they spoke here before ever the Romans came, before ever a word of English was heard in these islands, one of the oldest living languages in all of Europe, was not a subject taught in a schoolroom for an hour a week, not a thing the old folk half remembered, not a heritage or a hobby or a cause, but simply and completely the whole medium of a living human world. Here the chapel prayed in Welsh and sang its great hymns in Welsh and preached in Welsh. Here the school taught its small children in Welsh, and they learnt their letters in Welsh and recited in Welsh and quarrelled and laughed in the yard in Welsh. Here the farmer called his dog in Welsh across the open hill and counted his sheep in the old Welsh counting, and named his fields with Welsh names. His grandfather's grandfather had given them. Here the mother sang her child to sleep in Welsh, and the old man said his last words in Welsh. And every hearth and every field and every gate and every stone of the place lived and breathed entirely in the old tongue, from the first word of the morning to the last word of the night. Without effort, and without thought, and without any sense at all that it was anything remarkable, because to the people who lived it was not remarkable, it was only the water they swam in, it was only the air, and that above all, is what made this small valley precious beyond the counting of its houses. That is why you must hold the language in your mind as the truest treasure of the place, more precious than the water or the grass or the hay or the sheltering hills, because a house can be built again and a farm can be made again on other ground, but a living pocket of an ancient tongue, a place where a whole community still carries the old language whole and unbroken from cradle to grave. That is a thing that cannot be moved and cannot be rebuilt, and, once it is broken up and scattered, cannot ever truly be put back together again. And so when the men from the distant city looked at their maps and saw only a convenient empty valley with a useful river running through it, a low green trough that would hold a great deal of water, what they could not see and did not think to weigh, because it does not show upon any map, was that they were proposing to pour their reservoir not merely over a dozen farms and a chapel and a school, but over one of the last living hearths of the oldest language in the land, to drown not only houses, but a way of being, a way of speaking, a way of praying and counting and singing and dreaming that had come down unbroken through more years than anyone could number, and to break it up and send its speakers away one by one to live henceforth among strangers in a stranger tongue. But all of that is still to come, and I have kept you up on the high cold moor long enough now, in the wind, among the peat pools and the cotton grass. Looking down, it is time to come off the tops. So take my hand and let us go down now. Down off the wet open moor and out of the wind, down the long shoulder of the mountain, following the young bright river as she runs, down past where the open hill gives way to the first walled fields, down to where the dry stone walls begin to run in their long grey lines across the grain, and the little hawthorn hedges start. Down to where the first grey slate roof shows itself among the trees by the water, and a thread of blue peat smoke stands up straight in the still evening air, down at last off the bare shape of the land and into the inhabited fold, into the warm-lit living heart of the place while it still lived. For there are people down there, and a chapel with a bell, and a school full of children, and a whole small world going about its evening entirely in the old tongue, and entirely certain that its tomorrow would be the same as all its yesterdays, and it is time, at last, and very gently, that you and I went down and met them. And so we come down at last off the high wet ground, and into the fold itself, down out of the wind and the moor grass into the sheltered green heart of the valley where the people were, and I want you to slow your breathing now, and let yourself simply arrive, the way you would arrive at a place you had walked a long way to reach, footsore and glad, with the light going gold across the fields and the smell of wood smoke coming to you on the air before ever you saw a roof. That particular blue thread of peat smoke and coal smoke that means, always and everywhere, that somewhere close ahead of you there are hearths lit and kettles on and people at home. This was Capel Celyn as it truly was, not the still pale water you already know is coming, not the drowned and lost thing waiting at the end of our long night, but the living valley in its ordinary fullness through the first long half of the last century, warm and fed and whole and entirely certain of itself, and I mean to walk you through it now gently, house by house and field by field, and let it be alive around you for a while, because a place must be loved a little before its loss can mean anything at all, and I would have you love this one the way its own people loved it, quietly and without fuss, and as though it would simply always be there. It was never a large place, and I would not have you imagine anything grand. Count it with me and you will see how small and how sufficient it was. Something like a dozen houses in all, a scattering of greystone farmhouses and lower smallholdings strung out along the floor of the valley and set back into the first rise of the green slopes on either side, each one with its own huddle of stone outbuildings, its byre and its barn, and its little walled haggard for the hay. Its few sheltering trees bent all one way by the prevailing wind, its dogs and its geese and its washing strung on a line between two posts, and running the whole of the valley through them, gathering off the peat above and going down clear and quick over its stones toward the great lake of Barla below, the young river, the Afon Tryrin, which had given the valley its name, and which would, in the bitter fullness of time, be made the instrument of its ending, though nobody walking beside it in these years had the least thought of any such thing. Perhaps 48 souls lived here, all told, when the valley was at its fullest, not 50, you understand, a number small enough to be held whole in a single mind, small enough that every man and woman and child of them was known to all the rest by name and by voice and by the particular way they came down the lane, small enough that a birth was the whole valley's gladness and a death the whole valley's grief, and no soul among them ever went uncounted, or unmissed, or unmourned. 48 people, a dozen hearths, and the whole apparatus by which a place knows itself to be a place, and not merely a stretch of country with houses on it, for down at the heart of them, where the valley floor ran widest and most level and the lane came together, stood the 3 small buildings that made the 48 into a community, that made Capel Celyn a name and not just a map reference. And these were the post office, and the chapel, and the one-room school. There was even, threading its patient way along the floor of the valley, a railway, though you must put out of your mind entirely the great roaring iron thing that word might call up in you, for this was a little narrow gauge line, a slender single track of the old Barla to Festiniog run, coming up out of the woods below and going away over the moor toward the slate country, and it had here its own tiny halt, no more than a single short stone platform set beside the rails, with a small wooden name board standing on it, no grand station, no clerk, no bustle. Only that small, quiet platform where 2 or 3 times a day a small train would slow and breathe and take up a churn of milk, or a parcel or a single passenger going down to the market at Barla, and then gather itself and go on, its small smoke trailing back along the valley and thinning into the mountain air, and the platform would be left empty, and patient again in the green quiet, waiting for the next time. I want you to hold that little halt in your mind for a moment, that small wooden name board with the Welsh name painted on it standing all alone beside the single track, because there is something in it of the whole nature of the place, a small quiet door onto the wider world, used gently and seldom, by a people who had all that they truly needed already, close about them, in the fold. For this was above all a self-sufficing place, a place that fed and warmed and taught and buried its own, that looked to the wide world beyond the ridge for very little and asked of it less, and if you had stood in the lane on any ordinary weekday of those years, you would have understood at once, without a word said, how little this valley needed of anywhere else. But of the 3 small buildings at the heart of it, there is one that stood above the others, one that was the true centre and the true clock of the whole community, by which the days and the weeks and the seasons and the very years of the place were counted and kept, and that of course was the chapel, the little chapel that gave the valley its name, Capel Celyn, the chapel of the holly, and I would have us go in there now, quietly, the way you would go into any chapel, with your voice lowered though there is no one to hush you, and stand a while in the plainness and the peace of it. It was a small building and a plain one, and its plainness was not poverty, but a kind of faith made visible, for these were Welsh nonconformist people, chapel people, and their whole way of worship set its face against ornament and display, and turned instead toward the bare and the true. Grey stone without, single-storied and low, with a steep dark roof of the local slate and tall round arched windows of small clear rectangular panes that let the plain daylight in without colouring it, and a modest whitewashed gable end facing the lane, and up on that gable a single small bell-cote of stone, holding one small bell. Hold that bell in your mind, for it matters more than its smallness would ever tell you, and we shall come back to it before the night is through, and it will be one of the small warm stones you carry all the way to the end, a little bell of aged bronze, green-brown with the weather of many years, hung on a simple black iron yoke, and rung by hand on a Sunday morning to call the valley in, its small clear note going out across the fields and up the slopes, and being heard at every hearth and in every byre, so that a man out on the hill with his sheep would hear it come thin and sweet up the wind, and know the hour, and straighten his back, and turn for home. And within, when you came in out of the daylight, all was whitewashed and clean and simple, the walls a plain lime white, the floor of scrubbed board or plain stone, and the pews were dark box pews of old stained wood set in their sober rows, each with its little door, worn smooth and dark along the top rail by generations of hands, and at the front. Raised up so that the word might be sent out over the heads of the gathered people, stood the pulpit, plain and dark and dignified, the one high place in all that low plain room, and beside it, humble and household, stood the small pedal harmonium that gave the note and held the singing together. And oh, the singing! If you know one thing of the Welsh chapel and its valleys, you will know this one, for it is the thing that all who ever heard it remembered longest and spoke of always after with a kind of wonder, that on a Sunday, in a small plain room such as this one, 48 ordinary country people, farmers and shepherds and their wives and their sons and daughters, could open their mouths and make between them a sound to lift the hair on your arms and bring the water to your eyes. The great hymns of their people sung not in a thin single line but in full 4-part harmony, the men taking the low ground and the women the high, and the parts woven together as naturally as breathing, learned not from any page but from the cradle and the hearth, so that the whole small chapel became one great instrument, and the sound of it swelled and filled the room and pressed out through the tall clear windows and rolled away up the green valley and up the bare slopes above, and a traveller on the high moor a mile off, hearing it come faint and full on the wind, might stop and stand still, and not quite know why his throat had tightened. That was the sound of a Sunday in Capel Celyn, and around it turned the whole ordered life of the chapel, the preacher in the high pulpit, the long faithful sermons in the old tongue, the Sunday school where the children learnt their verses and their catechism, all of it in Welsh, every word of it, and once a year the Eisteddfod, that particular flowering of this people's love of their own language and their own arts, when the small community would gather to recite and to sing and to compete gently in the making and the speaking of poetry, the children standing up one after another to give their piece by heart, the voices rising in the old measures, prizes given and modestly received, and the whole valley turned out to listen and to praise. This was not a poor place. Whatever it may have looked to an outsider's eye, it was rich in the way that mattered most to it, rich in words and in music and in one another, and it counted its wealth in things that no engineer's survey would ever think to measure or find any way to price. And close by the chapel, sharing the heart of the place with it, stood the second of the small buildings I would have you hold and love, the one-room school, and here I must slow us down again and bring you in carefully, because within these plain walls sits the second of the warm stones you are to carry through the night, and it is a small and tender one, the children's slates, and the small Welsh names chalked up upon the board. It was a modest stone schoolroom, slate-roofed like the chapel, with 2 tall windows to let in the light, and within it was a single classroom, and in that one room the whole rising generation of the valley was taught together, the small ones and the bigger ones in their rows of worn wooden desks, each desk scarred and inked and initialed by the children who had sat there before, A cast-iron stove in the corner throwing out its heat on a cold morning, and the smell of it, of coal and warm dust and chalk, filling the room, and along the wall by the door a low row of coat pegs, each with its small coat and its cap hung upon it, and beneath them the small boots in a line, drying, and at the front the board black and gleaming and the chalk, and the children's own slates on the desks before them, those little framed tablets of grey slate on which a child would write and wipe and write again, the slate pencil squeaking, the small careful letters going down and being rubbed away and going down once more, and the names that were chalked up on the board and copied down onto the slates were Welsh names, every one, the soft old names of that soft old tongue, and the lessons were in Welsh, and the songs at the day's beginning were in Welsh, and the whispering under the desks was in Welsh. For this, above and beyond all else, was what made this valley unlike any other, what made its loss so much more than the loss of a dozen houses. It was one of the last places on the earth where the whole of life, the chapel and the school and the hearth and the field, ran entire and unbroken in the old language, and here in this one small room the children of the valley were handed that language down whole, as it had been handed to their parents and their parents' parents, without their ever once being told that it was precious or endangered, or anything other than simply and forever the way that words were said. And moving among those desks, bending down to guide a small hand around a difficult letter, was the schoolteacher, and I would have you see her as clearly as I do, for she belongs to the valley and to the night. A woman still young, in her early 30s, slight and neat and quiet in her ways, her dark brown hair drawn back and gathered into a low soft bun at the nape of her neck. Her eyes a pale grey blue, and her face a calm and gentle one, patient, unhurried, made for the reassuring of small anxious children, and she wore, as she always wore, a long high-necked dress of dark navy wool, with a small white collar turned down at the throat, and over it a soft grey knitted cardigan against the chill of the room before the stove had properly caught. And she moved along the rows in the morning light with a stillness about her that the children took in without knowing they took it, so that a nervous child grew calm merely by her passing near. She would take down the day's work and pin up the new. She would hear the recitations and lead the small morning hymn. She would wipe the youngest one's slate and set the copy fresh. And at the end of the day she would watch them go, the small coats lifted down from the low pegs and the small boots stamped on, and the children streaming out into the green afternoon and away up the lanes to the scattered farms, calling to one another in their own language across the fields, until the last voice thinned into the general quiet and the schoolroom stood empty and swept and waiting for the morning. And out on those scattered farms, out on the green slopes above the valley floor and up onto the open hill beyond, was the other half of the life of the place, the working half, the shepherding half. For this was sheep country first and last, hard upland pasture that would carry the small hardy mountain sheep and little else. And the year here was measured out not only by the Sundays of the chapel and the terms of the school, but by the great unchanging round of the shepherd's work, and I would have you meet the man who did it. For he too is one of the valley's own, and belongs to your keeping tonight. An old hill farmer, in his late 60s now, with a weathered and ruddy and deeply lined face. A face worked on by 70 winters of wind and rain and sun off the snow, silver-white hair beneath a flat tweed cap, pale blue eyes that had spent a lifetime reading weather and distance, stocky and sturdy and slow-moving and strong, and he wore the heavy brown tweed jacket and the buttoned waistcoat and the collarless cream shirt of his kind, and corduroy trousers, and worn hobnailed boots that had walked more miles of that hillside than any road, and in his hand a bent hazel crook worn pale and smooth by his grip. And always, close at his heel, low and quick and watchful, one eye on the sheep and one eye on his master, the black and white sheepdog, without whom no shepherd of those hills could do his work at all. And the round of that work turned over the year as it had turned for 1,000 years, and would, the old man never doubted, turn for 1,000 more, the gathering, when the scattered sheep were brought down off the wide hill in the autumn, the dog running out huge and silent across the slope at a low word and a lifted hand. The flock drawn in from all the far folds of the mountain and funneled down toward the pens, and the shearing in its due season, the wool coming off in one warm heavy fleece under the swift practised hands. And hardest and most watchful of all, the lambing, those raw cold weeks of the early year when the ewes came to their time and a man could not rest. When night after night the old farmer would go out into the dark with his lantern held up before him, and walk the cold hillside among his labouring flock, and if you had stood in the valley on such a night, and looked up, you would have seen that one small yellow light moving slow along the black shoulder of the hill, going out and pausing, and going on, a man watching over the coming of the new life in the dark and the cold, hour after hour, so that by lambing's end he was grey and hollow with tiredness, but the fields by day were full of the small new white shapes bucking and playing in the thin spring sun, and the whole valley had been renewed once more, and the work had been done as it was always done, quietly, by hand, by men who asked no help and expected none, and needed none. And this, you see, was the deep truth of Capel Celyn, the thing I most want to leave with you before the shadow comes, that it was a whole thing, a complete and self-turning world, needing nothing from beyond the ridge, changing its distant kings and its distant governments in London without ever changing by so much as an hour the near and daily and immemorial ways of its own life, the bell on a Sunday and the slate in the schoolroom and the lantern on the hill, and doing all of it in its own old tongue, and doing it with the deep unspoken certainty of a place that has always been and cannot imagine that it will not always be. The people of this valley did not think of themselves as living in a place that could be taken away. Why would they? A man does not stand in his own kitchen with his own children about him, and the smell of the evening meal rising, and think, one day the water will close over this room. He thinks only that tomorrow he will do again what he did today, that the ewes will lamb and the hay will be cut, and the children will go down the lane to the school and come home again, that on Sunday the bell will ring and the valley will sing in 4 parts as it has always sung, and that his afternoon, this good and ordinary and sufficient afternoon, will simply go on. And it is right that they thought so, and I would not for the world have you think them foolish for it is what all of us think, every one of us, in every safe and ordinary hour of our lives, and it is the only way that a human heart can bear to live at all, in the plain trust that the ground beneath it will hold. And yet I must, before I let this warm chapter close, and let the valley rest a little longer in its unknowing peace, plant one small seed in the quiet, gently, so that it does not startle you, only enough that you will not be taken wholly unawares when the next part of the story comes, for I promised you at the very first that nothing in this night would leap out at you from the dark, that every turn would be laid down before you well ahead of time, and so I lay this one down now, softly, and then we will let it be. Far off, over the mountains, beyond the ridge and beyond the moor, and beyond many another green valley and grey ridge besides, out where the land at last runs down to the sea, and the country changes, and the old tongue is no longer spoken in the streets, there was a great city, and the great city was growing. It was growing very fast in those years, growing outward and upward, filling with people and with works, and with all the vast machinery of a modern industrial age. And a city that grows must drink, for a city is a great thirsty thing, and this one drank and looked always about it for more to drink, and it had long been in the habit, this city and others like it, of looking for its water not to its own doorstep but away up into the high wet green country of Wales, where the rain falls without ceasing on the mountains, and the rivers run always full and clear and cold. None of this was known in Capel Celyn, or if the name of the far city was known at all, it was known only as the name of a far place, a place a man might have a cousin in, a place the wool might go to. No more, no one in the valley heard, in the small clear ringing of the Sunday bell, any answering sound from over the mountains. No one saw, in the lantern moving along the dark hillside, any warning light. The thirst of the growing city was a thing that belonged wholly to another world, a world of committees and maps and engineers and figures on a page, and it had not yet reached out its hand toward this particular green fold, among all the green folds of Wales, and for now, tonight, in this warm chapter, it has not touched them at all. So let us leave them there, in the fullness and the safety of it, and let the seed lie quiet in the ground where I have set it. Let the bell hang still and green-brown in its little coat, waiting for Sunday. Let the slates lie clean on the worn desks, and the small Welsh names stand chalked upon the board. Let the schoolteacher draw her grey cardigan about her against the morning chill, and move down the rows in the plain daylight. Let the old farmer come down off the hill at dusk with his dog at his heel and his crook in his hand and the day's work done. And let him see as he comes down the small warm lights coming on one by one in the scattered houses of the valley, and the blue smoke rising straight in the still evening air, and the whole small world of Capel Celyn folded safe and fed, and unknowing into the green lap of its mountains, certain, wholly certain, that its afternoon would simply go on. It did not know. It could not know. And for a little while longer, here in the warm heart of the night, neither need we. Rest here with them a moment. The valley is safe. The valley is whole. And the light has not yet begun to go. And so the thing came over the mountains, the way weather comes, out of a sky that no one in the valley had been watching, from a place none of them had ever thought to fear, and I want to bring it to you slowly and plainly, the way I have promised to bring you everything tonight, with no sudden turn in it, and no part of it kept back to trouble you later, because although this is the chapter in which the sorrow begins its long approach, there is nothing in it that will startle you, and you already know how it ends, and you may let it wash over you and sleep straight through it if you like. The thing that came was not an army, and not a storm, and not a sickness. It was a need. It was, of all the plain and ordinary things in the world, a thirst, a great and growing thirst, 100 miles away, in a place that most of the people of Capel Celyn had never seen and would never see. A place of docks and warehouses and smoking chimneys and long grey terraced streets running down to a wide brown river, and I will name it for you now, gently, because you will want to know the name of the far thing that reached out its hand across all those mountains and closed it, in the end, over that small green valley. The place was Liverpool, a city on the English side of the water, up on the Mersey, one of the greatest ports in all the world in those years. A city that had grown and grown through the long century of coal and iron and steam, until it held the better part of 1 million souls within it, and more coming, more houses, more streets, more factories, more people every year needing to drink and to wash and to work. And a city like that, you understand, a great engine of a city packed tight with all those hundreds of thousands of lives, is above everything else a thing that is thirsty, endlessly and helplessly thirsty, needing water not by the bucket or the barrel, but by the lake, by the reservoir, by the 100 million gallons a day, water for the taps and the boilers and the mills. Water that has to come from somewhere, that has to fall as rain on some high wet ground, and be gathered and held and sent down in great pipes to the streets. And Liverpool, standing where it stood on its low dry sandstone by the sea, had no such high wet ground of its own. So it looked, the way thirsty cities in those years always looked, west and inland toward the hills, and the nearest great gathering ground of rain, the nearest wide country of high wet mountains where the water came down out of the sky in a plenty that no city could ever drink dry, lay across the border in Wales. And here I must tell you something that will help you understand how the thing that happened to Capel Celyn could happen at all, could be thought of, could be spoken of in committee rooms as an ordinary piece of business, and it is this: it had all been done before. This was not the first Welsh valley that an English city had cast its eye upon and found convenient. It was not even the first that Liverpool had taken. For you have to picture how it looked from those far city offices, from behind those desks, with the maps spread out. The mountains of Wales lying there green and high, and full of rain, and to such eyes so very nearly empty. A few scattered farms, a few chapels, a thin scatter of people speaking among themselves a language the map-makers could not read. Ground that seemed, to a man who had never stood in it and never heard the singing come up out of it on a Sunday, to be waiting, almost, to be put to some proper use. And so, in the long years before ever Capel Celyn was thought of, the taking had already begun, quietly, and been met with so little that could stop it, that by the time the engineers came to the Tryweryn, it had the settled, unquestioned feel of a thing that was simply done, the way things are done. Away to the south of Barla, over the hills, there had once been another small valley village, Llanydin, in the Vale of the Vyrnwy. A whole parish of it, a church and a chapel and its farms and its people, and in the last quarter of the 1800s Liverpool, this very same city, reaching out this very same hand, had built a great dam across the foot of it and drowned the whole of it under a long dark lake to slake the city's thirst, and had moved the people out and pulled the old church down and let the water climb over the valley, and called the new lake Vyrnwy, Lyneffenwy, and piped its water the long miles east to the Liverpool taps, and it stands there yet, that older drowning, that first one, a beautiful and sorrowful sheet of water in the hills that most who pass it now do. Not know was ever anything else, and that was not the only one. To the south again, in the high green country of Ellanid, another great English city, Birmingham this time, thirsty in its own turn, had gone into the Elan Valley in those same years and dammed it and drowned it. Farm and chapel and the little houses and the very cottage, they say, where a poet had once lived, all of it under a chain of long reservoirs, and piped that water away too, the whole 100 and more miles to the Birmingham taps. So you see how it was. You see the shape that was already worn into the world by the time the men with the maps came up the Tryweryn. Drowning a Welsh valley to water an English city was not, in those years, a strange or a shocking thing, not a thing anyone in Westminster or in the great city corporations thought long about. It was a known thing, a done thing, an established and barely questioned practice. A solution that reached for itself almost without thinking whenever a city grew thirsty and a map showed green empty seeming hills across the border, and that, more than any cruelty in any single heart, is the quiet cold engine at the middle of this story, and I want you to hold it as you drift. Because it explains everything that follows and it asks you to hate no one in particular, it was not that any man set out to do a wickedness to Capel Celyn. It was that a whole way of doing things had grown up unexamined, in which a valley such as that one simply did not weigh very much, weighed almost nothing, against the thirst of a city, in which the people who lived in it were not, in any way that counted, consulted, in which the deciding was done far off, on paper, by men to whom the place was a blue line and a contour on a survey, and never a home. So the engineers came. That is how it began. In the years after the last war, in the early 1950s, with men in good coats and stout boots walking the valley floor with their instruments and their notebooks, measuring the fall of the river, sounding the ground, standing at the narrow throat where the valley pinched in near its lower end, and looking at it the way a builder looks at a doorway, and going away again, and coming back, and driving in their marker pegs, and the people of Capel Celyn saw them, of course, and wondered, and asked, and were told little, and hoped it would come to nothing, the way you hope a shadow on the skyline is only cloud. But it did not come to nothing. For the surveyors had found what they had come to find. They had found that the Tryweryn Valley, that quiet green fold with its dozen farms and its chapel and its one-room school, was, by the cold reckoning of the engineers, close to perfect for their purpose. A broad, steep-sided bowl to hold the water, a narrow, firm neck at the bottom to carry a dam, a high, wet gathering ground of moorland above to keep it always filled, and running through it the good faithful Afon Tryweryn to do the filling, and so, in 1955, the corporation of the city of Liverpool resolved that here, in this valley, they would build their new reservoir, and dam the Tryweryn, and drown Capel Celyn under it, and pipe its water away across the whole breadth of North Wales and over the border to the streets of Liverpool. And now I must explain to you, as gently and as clearly as I can, the exact machinery by which such a thing could be done to a place against the will of everyone who lived in it and everyone who spoke for it. Because it is in the machinery, in one small dry piece of law, that the deepest sorrow of this story really lies. Not in the water, in the end, but in the paper. And once you understand it, you will understand why the people did every right and lawful and peaceable thing that could be done, and why none of it, not one single act of it, was able to save them. You would think, would you not, that to take a whole inhabited valley, to drown 12 farms and a chapel and a school, and turn 40-odd people out of homes their families had held for centuries, a great city would have to come and ask, would have to put its case to the county, to the local authorities, to Wales, to the people whose ground it was, and win their consent, and be refused if they refused. And in the ordinary run of things, for the ordinary run of building, that would have been so. But Liverpool did not go that way, because there was another way, an old and powerful and perfectly legal way, and Liverpool took it. What the corporation did was to promote, through the Parliament of the whole United Kingdom, sitting in Westminster, a thing called a private bill, a private act of Parliament, a piece of law made not for the whole country, but for one body, the city of Liverpool, granting to that one city the particular powers it wanted for this one scheme, the power to buy the land whether the owners would sell or no, the power to dam the river, the power to flood the valley. And here is the quiet devastation of it, the thing I want you to hold as clearly as you can, even as sleep comes for you. Because it went by way of a private act of the Westminster Parliament, the scheme did not have to be granted planning permission by any Welsh authority at all. It went clean over the top of Wales. It did not need the consent of the County Council of Merioneth, in whose ground the valley lay. It did not need the consent of any Welsh planning body, any Welsh minister, any Welsh voice whatsoever. The whole decision, whether this Welsh valley should live or drown, was lifted up out of Wales entirely, and carried east across the border and set down on the floor of a parliament in which Welsh members were a small handful among 600 and more, to be settled by a vote of the whole House, English votes and all, most of them cast by men who had never heard of Capel Celyn and would forget its name before the week was out. That is the mechanism. That is how you drown a valley that does not wish to be drowned. You arrange matters so that the people of the valley, and their county, and their nation, are simply not among those who get to decide. And the people of Capel Celyn understood, when they grasped what was being done, exactly how heavy a thing had been set against them, and I want to tell you now what they did. Because this is the true moral heart of the whole chapter, and it is a thing to be proud of, and it is also the thing that breaks the heart, and the two are the same thing. They fought. Not with any violence, there was never any violence in them, it was never their way, but with every decent, lawful, patient, dignified means that a small and peaceable people could lay their hands on, they fought for their homes. This was a community, remember, that had never made any trouble in all its long life, that had kept its own quiet ways up its own quiet valley, and asked nothing of the world, and troubled no one. And now these same gentle people, these hill farmers and chapel-goers, and the school-teacher and the old shepherds, organised themselves, soberly and seriously, to resist. They formed a committee and gave it a plain name, the Capel Celyn Defence Committee, and they met, and they wrote letters, and they gathered their arguments, and they set about the long, unglamorous work of trying to be heard. And in the year 1956 they did a thing that I find, when I sit with it, almost unbearably moving in its mildness and its courage. And I want you to picture it as you lie there in the dark, a busload of them, the villagers themselves, the people of Capel Celyn, the men and the women, some of the very people whose houses were to go under, travelled out of their valley, the long road east, all the way to Liverpool, to the great city itself, to the very place whose thirst was to drown them, and there, in the streets of Liverpool. Among the traffic and the crowds and the tall grey buildings, they walked. They marched, quietly and in good order, through the centre of the city, carrying placards they had made. And on the placards were written, in plain words, the plainest and most human plea there is, which was, in its whole meaning, please do not drown our homes. Please do not drown our village. We live here. This is where we live. They carried that through the streets of the city that was going to do it, these country people far from their own hills, walking past the shop windows and the office doors, holding up their painted boards and asking, with all the dignity in the world, only to be let alone, only to be allowed to keep the ground they stood on. And I have to tell you honestly, because I will not lie to you in the dark, how that plea was met, for it is part of the sorrow, and you can bear it, because you already know that the sorrow, in the long end, turns to something else. It was met, for the most part, with indifference. The great city went on about its business around them. Some who saw them were kind, or troubled, or ashamed, but many simply passed by. And some met the marchers with hostility, with jeering, with the plain hard message that a city's thirst mattered and a handful of Welsh farmers did not. And the marchers walked their quiet mile through all of it, and got back on their bus and went home to the valley, having been, in the way that mattered, not heard at all. But they did not give it up, even then, even after that long cold walk through the unhearing city, for the Defence Committee kept on, month after month, doing every patient thing that was left to be done, writing to the newspapers and to the ministers, and to anyone at all who might listen, gathering their case together and sending men to give evidence, in their careful English, before the committees of the Parliament that would decide them, standing up in those far-panelled rooms to say, plainly and with dignity, that people lived in this valley, that it was not empty, that it was a whole and living community with a language and a chapel and a school, and that to drown it was not a small thing, and slowly, as they laboured, something did begin to stir beyond the valley, for their cause was taken up, here and there across Wales, by others who saw in it something larger than one small village, who understood that what was being done to Capel Celyn was being done, in a way, to the whole idea that Wales had any say over its own ground, and voices were raised for them in the pulpits and the newspapers and the meeting halls, and there were men, some of whose names Wales would come to remember, who stood by the little committee and lent it their weight, and would not let the matter be quietly buried. But you must understand, and it is the sorrow of it, that all this gathering sympathy, real and growing as it was, could not touch the one thing that mattered, could not alter by a single vote the cold arithmetic of that distant Parliament, in which the valley's friends, however many and however earnest, were never going to be enough. And then the thing went to the Parliament, to the floor of the House, to the vote, and here you will see the whole cruelty of the machinery laid bare, because the Welsh members of Parliament, the men sent to Westminster by the people of Wales to speak for Wales, understood exactly what was being done to one of their own valleys, and they stood against it. Very nearly to a man they stood against it. When the votes were counted on the matter of Tryweryn of the Welsh members in that Parliament, 35 of the 36 voted against the bill, against the drowning, against the taking of Capel Celyn. 35 of 36. Wales, through the men it had sent to speak for it, said no, said it almost with a single voice, said it as plainly and as nearly unanimously as any nation ever says anything. And it did not matter. It did not count. It could not count. Because of the machinery. Because the 35 were 35 among 600, a small Welsh voice drowned out, and there is no other word for it, by the great English majority of a Parliament, to whom the whole affair was a minor private bill about a city's waterworks, nodded through among 100 other pieces of business, and the bill passed. It passed. In 1957 it received the royal assent and became an act, the law of the land, and the valley's fate was sealed in dry ink in a book of statutes far away, and there was, from that moment, no lawful thing left that anyone could do to stop it. And I want you to sit with the particular grief of that softly before we go on, because it is a grief that many people know in their own lives in smaller ways, and it is worth the naming. It is the grief of lawful powerlessness, the grief of having done everything right and lost anyway. There was no villain to overthrow, no crime to expose, no rule that had been broken that might be unbroken. There was nothing improper to point at. Everything had been done according to the law. The bill had been properly promoted, properly debated, properly voted upon, properly passed. And the people of Capel Celyn had, on their side, done everything a people is supposed to do. They had organised, they had petitioned, they had marched, they had argued their case with patience and dignity and truth. They had persuaded almost the whole of their own nation's representatives to their side, and they had lost, cleanly and completely and legally, because the one thing they had never been given, the one thing that had been arranged from the very start that they should never have, was a vote that counted on the question of their own homes. Every proper, peaceful, democratic thing that could be done had been done, and none of it had made the smallest difference to the outcome, because the outcome had been placed, deliberately, in hands that were not theirs and not their nation's, in the hands of people who did not live in the valley, had never walked in it, would never see it, and to whom it was, and would always be, only a line on a map and a useful place to put some water. And so the sentence was handed down. That is the plain end of this chapter, and it is a hard one, but you knew it was coming, and it will not keep you from your rest. The act was passed, the law was made, the valley was condemned. Capel Celyn, the chapel and the school and the dozen farms, the whitewashed room and the little bell, the desks and the slates and the small Welsh names chalked upon the boards, the burial ground with its stones, the whole living valley that had kept its green through so many winters, was now, in the eye of the law, a reservoir that had not yet filled, a thing already decided, already ended, only waiting on the engineers to make it so. And the strange, the almost unbearable thing, the thing I will leave you with as the light goes down on this part of the story, is that after the sentence was handed down, life in the valley did not stop. It could not stop. The sentence was passed, but the water was not yet come. The act was law, but the dam was not yet built. And so the people of Capel Celyn went on living in their condemned valley, for years yet, knowing all the while what was to come, went on with the lambing and the shearing and the hay, went on ringing the bell on a Sunday and sending the children down the lane to the school, went on lighting the lamps in the evening and banking the fires, living out their ordinary faithful days in a place that the law had already drowned on paper and only waited to drown in fact. They lived under the sentence. They lived in the shadow of the rising water that had not yet begun to rise. And that is where we must leave the valley tonight, for a little while, condemned but not yet taken, whole but no longer safe, going quietly on with its evenings and its mornings beneath a doom that had been decided 100 miles away by people who would never come to see it done. Rest now if you are ready to rest. You have carried the hardest part, the part where the wrong is done and cannot be undone, and it is behind you now, and all that is left ahead is the long, slow, gentle grief of the leaving. And then, after that, further off than you can yet see, the grace. The act is past. The valley lives on under it. And the water waits. And so the valley lived under its sentence, the way a field lives under a coming winter, going quietly on with all its small tasks, while the thing that will end it draws slowly nearer. There was no single day when the taking began. That is one of the gentler mercies of how it happened, and one of the harder cruelties too, for a swift blow can be met and mourned in one clean stroke, but a slow one has to be lived through hour by hour, and the people of Capel Celyn lived through theirs across 5 long years, from about 1960 to the autumn of 1965, doing every hard thing decently, in order, and in their own language, until the whole world of the valley had been folded up and carried out, and there was nothing left to carry. Let me take you through those years slowly now, the way they were lived, one careful task at a time. For there is nothing in them to fear, only a long tenderness, and if you have somewhere warm to lie while I tell it, then lie there and let the years go by soft as water. The first great sign of the ending was not in the village at all, but down at the mouth of the valley, at the narrow place where the land pinches in and the Afon Tryrin had run out toward Bala since before anyone had a name for it. There the engineers came, and the machines, and the men in their donkey jackets and their heavy boots, and they began to build the dam. It rose slowly, the way such things rise, a long, low grey wall of concrete laid across the throat of the valley, section by section, poured and set and poured again, growing week by week into a barrier that the eye could not quite believe, because it was so plainly meant to hold back a great weight of water that was not yet there. You could stand up on the green slope above and look down at it and see the shape of the lake that was coming, mapped out in the mind before a single field had flooded, and know that the pale still sheet you were imagining would one day lie exactly over the roof you had slept under all your life. The old hill farmer would have seen it, on his way down with the dog to the lower ground, the grey wall growing across the valley he had shepherded for 50 years, and he would have said little, because there was little to say, and what there was had already been said, at Liverpool and at Westminster, by men who had not listened. He would only have looked, and gone on, and the dog would have gone on at his heel, and the sheep would have grazed the slopes as they always had, not knowing they grazed above a lake. The dam did not hurry. It had no need to hurry. It rose all through those years with the patient certainty of a thing that has already won, and every month it was higher. And every month the valley people looked at it a little longer before they turned away. And then, while the wall was still rising, the community turned to the task that no one had wanted to name, the hardest and most tender act of the whole long taking, the one that tells you more about who these people were than any placard or petition ever could. They lifted their dead. For if the valley was to go under the water, then the graves in the little chapel burial ground would go under too, and the people of Capel would not have that. They would not leave their own beneath the lake. So the graves were opened, with all the care and all the reverence that such a thing demands, the old resting places in the ground beside the chapel where the families of the valley had been laid down for generations, and the coffins were lifted, gently, out of the earth that had held them, and carried up out of the valley to higher ground, to be laid down again above the line the water would reach, so that they might rest where the lake could never come. Think what that asks of a people. Think of the men of the valley, farmers and chapel elders, standing in the burial ground where their own grandparents lay, doing with their own hands or watching done the exhuming of their dead, not in war, not in disaster, but by arrangement, by schedule, because a city far away wanted water, and the law had said the city might have it. They did it because the only thing worse than moving their dead was leaving them, and they chose the lesser grief, and they carried it. And they carried the coffins too, up the slope in the grey Welsh light to the new ground, and among the graves that were lifted, you must understand, were the small ones. For a burial ground that has served a valley for a long time holds all the valley's sorrows, and some of those sorrows are the size of a child. The little ones taken young in the old hard years before medicine could hold them, laid down small beside their families. Those too were lifted, and carried up, and laid down again, so that they should not lie under the water either. There is nothing to be said about that but that it was done, and done with love, and done because there was no other way to keep faith with the ones who could no longer speak for themselves. And when the graves were empty, and the ground reopened, and the coffins carried up, the headstones went too, the plain slate markers with their Welsh names and their dates cut deep, lifted from where they had leaned and stood these long years, and taken up to the new ground to be set again above the ones they named, so that even in the moving nothing should be lost. No name left behind to go under the water unmarked. They were a people who kept their records, and kept their dead, and kept their word, and they kept them now, at the very end, when keeping cost the most, because that was who they had always been, and the coming of the lake could change where they lived, and where their dead lay, but it could not change that. So the burial ground was lifted, stone and coffin and name, and carried up into the light. and only the empty hollows in the old ground were left behind for the water, and even those would soon be gone. The living moved the dead first, and only then did the living begin to move themselves. And that too went slowly, household by household, farm by farm, up and down the valley floor, each family in its own time and its own way. For there were the last things to be done first, the last turnings of the year that a farm must make whether or not it knows it is the last. There was a last lambing, the ewes brought down as they always were, the old farmer out in the cold dark of the spring hillside with his lantern going along the slope, as it had gone every lambing of his life, bending over the ewes in the wet grass, easing the new lambs into a world that would not keep them long in this valley. There was a last shearing, the fleeces rolled and stacked. There was a last hay cut on the meadows of the valley floor, the grass laid down in the long summer light, dried and turned and gathered, as it had been gathered every summer since the first family came up the fold and saw that the ground was good. And there was, at the end, the selling of the stock, the flocks that had been bred to these particular slopes over long lifetimes, the bloodlines that a shepherd carries in his head the way another man carries the names of his cousins, sold off and driven away down the valley to other men's land, because there would be no more grazing here once the water came. A hill flock is not a thing you can simply move. It is tied to its ground, hefted, the sheep knowing their own patch of mountain by instinct passed down the generations of ewes, and to break a flock up and sell it away is to end something that took 100 years to make and cannot be made again in a hurry. The old farmer would have watched his sheep go, and his dog would have stood beside him watching too, the pair of them at the gate as the flock went down the road, and that was a grief he would not have shown, because he was not a man to show it, but it was there in him all the same, deep as the peat. And one by one, through those years, the families left. Some had not far to go, taking new farms or new houses within reach of the old valley, close enough to drive up on a clear day and stand on the slope above the rising water and look at where they had lived. But others scattered far, carried away by work and by circumstance to distant towns, to the coalfields of the south, across the sea even, the way the valley's people had scattered once before, 300 years gone, when the first friends had sailed for Pennsylvania to worship free. The valley had given up its people to exile before, gently, long ago, and now it gave them up again, and this time it would not be there behind them to come home to. You would have seen it on the roads in those years, the leaving. A cart or a lorry drawn up in a farmyard, the furniture brought out into the daylight where furniture never belongs, the dresser and the table and the beds, the things of a house looking suddenly small and shabby in the open air, loaded and roped and taken away down the single valley road. And you would have seen, among the leaving families, the young mother with her headscarf knotted under her chin and her plain belted coat, and her two small children beside her, the boy in his grey knitted jumper and short trousers, and the girl in her hand knitted cardigan and pinafore, both of them in their scuffed leather boots, standing in the yard while the last of the house went on to the cart, not fully understanding, the way small children do not fully understand, only knowing that the grown people were quiet in a way that frightened them a little, and that they were going, and that they would not be coming back. The children of Capel were leaving the only valley they had ever known, and carrying out of it, in their small heads, the last living memory of what it had looked like with people in it, a memory they would keep all their long lives and hand on, so that 70 years later there would still be old men and women who could tell you what the valley smelled like on a Sunday morning, and what the chapel bell sounded like across the fields, because they had been those children, and they had carried it out. And when a family was gone, the house was shut, the door closed on the empty rooms, the windows dark, the hearth cold that had held a fire for 100 years, the yard silent where the dog had barked and the children had played. One by one the farms went dark up the valley, the smoke gone from the chimneys, and the valley that had been full grew slowly emptier and quieter, until the only sounds left were the wind and the river and the machines still working down at the dam. In the middle of it all stood the school, and the chapel, the two hearts of the community, and they too came to their ending in those last years, and their ending was the tenderest of all, because a school and a chapel are not private griefs but shared ones, belonging to everybody at once. The little one-room school that had taught the children of the valley their letters and their numbers and their hymns, all of it in Welsh, in the old tongue that was the whole point and treasure of the place, came at last to its final day. There were fewer and fewer children as the families left, the desks emptying one by one, the rows of small worn wooden seats standing vacant where a child had sat, until there were only a handful left, and then a last few, and then a last day for those. And the schoolteacher, the neat calm young woman with her dark hair drawn back, and her navy dress, and her soft grey cardigan, who had stood before those children morning after morning, and heard them recite, and heard them sing, went about the quiet work of closing her schoolroom down. She took the children's work from the walls, the drawings and the copied lines, and the maps of a country that would soon have one less valley in it, and she took down the things that had made the room a room for learning, and she cleaned the slate boards a last time. The small black slates the children had written on with their squeaking chalk, forming their letters, their Welsh names, the names of the valley, and she wiped them clean and stacked them, and the chalk dust settled, and the cast-iron stove went cold in the corner. And along the wall by the door, the low coat pegs, where every winter morning the children had hung their coats dripping from the rain, hung empty now in a row, and she looked at them, the bare pegs, and there is no sadness quite like the sadness of a coat peg, with no coat on it, in a room where children used to be. She turned the key in the school door, and the little building stood empty, the desks in their rows facing a blackboard no one would write on again, waiting in the dark for the water. And then there was the chapel, and its last service, which was the true last gathering of the valley, the moment when everything the place had been came together one final time before it was scattered for good. They came back for it, those who had already gone, driving up the valley roads to the plain grey chapel one more time, filling the dark box pews as they had filled them every Sunday of their lives and their parents' lives before them. The whitewashed walls, the raised wooden pulpit, the oil lamp, the little pedal harmonium in its corner, all of it just as it had always been, and the people in their places, and the preacher in the pulpit, and the old book open. And they sang. You must understand what the singing was in a place like this, for the hymn singing of the Welsh chapel is not a small or a thin thing, it is a great full sound, sung in 4 parts without any need of a book. The melody and the harmonies rising together from voices that have sung these tunes since childhood, the men's low lines beneath and the women's above. The whole congregation become one instrument, and in a small stone chapel that sound fills the room to the rafters and pours out through the tall round arched windows and across the fields and up the slopes of the valley, so that on a Sunday the whole fold of the mountains had rung with it, week upon week, year upon year, for as long as the chapel had stood. And now they sang it for the last time. They sang the old hymns, the ones that carried them through every joy and every burial the valley had ever known, and the harmonium played beneath, and the sound rose and filled the little chapel one final time. The voices maybe not quite steady, maybe breaking here and there, but the singing going on, because the singing had always gone on, because that was what they were and what they did. And they would not let the ending take even that from them. They would go out singing. And when the last hymn was sung, and the last word spoken from the pulpit, there was the bell. The small bell in its modest little bell-cote at the gable of the chapel, the aged bronze bell with its green-brown patina, hung on its simple black iron yoke, that had called the valley to worship morning and evening, that had been rung for weddings and tolled for funerals, that had marked the hours and the Sundays of Capel Celyn for longer than anyone living could remember. It was rung one last time. Someone took the rope, and the small bell swung in its cote, and its voice went out over the valley as it had gone out 10,000 times before, the same clear note, ringing across the emptying fields and the shut farmhouses and the still rising grey wall of the dam, and every soul who heard it knew that it was the last time, that the bell was speaking its own farewell over the ground it had watched. And then, before the water could take it, the bell was lifted down. They climbed to the bell-cote and unfastened it from its yoke and brought it down, the little bronze bell, out of the coat where it had hung so long, and they carried it up out of the valley, up above the line the lake would reach, to be kept. So that whatever else went under, the voice of the chapel would not. Hold on to that, as you lie there in the dark and the years go by. The bell was saved. Of all the things the water was going to take, the bell was carried up into the light, and kept, and it is kept still, and we will come to where it rests before the night is done. And with the bell, the pulpit too was salvaged, the raised wooden pulpit from which the word had been preached in Welsh for generations, taken down carefully and carried out, and the good stones of the chapel marked and saved, so that the heart of the place, its bell and its pulpit and its very stones, should not be lost with its walls, but should go up the hill to wait, and to be built again into a keeping place above the water. They took what could be carried of the soul of the valley, and they carried it to safety, and then they let the rest go, and the valley stood empty. That is the thing to see now. Before the water, the human valley finally and wholly empty, and yet still whole, still all there, the farmhouses standing shut with their cold hearths, the chapel standing bare with its bell gone from the coat, the school standing silent with its pegs empty, the dry stone walls running down the green slopes and dividing the meadows as they had for centuries, the old stone bridge arching over the Tryweryn, the little railway halt with its wooden name-board beside the narrow track, the roads, the yards, the gates, all of it still there. Still standing in the grey light, a complete village with every soul gone out of it, waiting. There is a particular quiet to a place that has been left, that is not the same as the quiet of a place that was always empty. It is a quiet that is full of what is missing. And Capel Celyn stood in that quiet, whole and abandoned, through its last days, while the dam held back the river and the water began, at last, to gather. For once the great wall was finished and the sluices closed, the Tryweryn had nowhere to go. The river that had run down the fold and out toward Barla since before the first people came, now met the grey concrete and stopped, and began to back up and began to rise. Slowly, so slowly at first that you might not have marked it from one day to the next, the water spread out across the lowest ground, over the meadows where the last hay had been cut, a thin sheet of pale water lying where the grass had been, growing wider, deepening. It crept up the valley floor, patient as the dam itself, and it found the dry stone walls, and it rose against them. And it climbed them stone by stone, the low walls that had stood dry in the wind for hundreds of years now standing in water, the water lapping higher up them week by week until only their tops showed, and then not even those. It reached the foundations of the emptied houses and stood in the yards where the children had played, and rose against the doorsteps, and came in under the shut doors into the cold rooms. It rose around the little school, and around the bare chapel with its empty bellcote. It found the old stone bridge and climbed its footings and rose toward the arch. And there was no violence in it, none at all, no roar, no flood, no wave, only the still pale water rising quietly and without haste in the broad bowl of the mountains, spreading and deepening under the wide Welsh sky, the sheep-cropped slopes rising green and russet all around it, just as they always had, the bare moorland peaks unchanged on the skyline, and the water climbing gently among the works of the valley, taking them under 1 soft inch at a time. Toward the end of it, at dusk, you might have stood up on the slope and looked down and seen the valley half drowned, the pale sheet of the new lake lying across the lower ground with the last of the light on it, violet and amber along the mountain horizon, and a soft blue-grey mist beginning to lie on the water, and out in the middle of that still and rising water, the last roofs, the dark slate roofs of the highest farmhouses, and the steep roof of the chapel, standing up out of the pale water in the fading light, smaller each day, the water climbing their walls toward the eaves. It was quiet. It was very quiet. Only the water, spreading, and the light going slowly off the mountains, and the last roofs of Capel Celyn standing above the lake in the dusk, waiting to go under, without a sound, without a struggle, the way the whole long taking had gone, decently and unbearably unto the very end, until the water should close over the last of them, and lie still. And there we will leave the valley for tonight, half under the rising water in the soft dusk light, the roofs still showing, the mist coming down, everything quiet. The bell is safe, the pulpit is safe. The dead are lifted and laid on higher ground where the lake will never reach them. The people are scattered, but they carry the valley in them and will keep it. The water is rising, gently, and it is nearly done, and there is nothing more that anyone can do, and nothing to be afraid of in the doing of it. Let it rise, slow and pale and still, and let the light go off the mountains, and rest now, for the hardest of the taking is over. And so the water came up over the last of it, in the quiet way that water always does, without malice and without hurry, closing over the low stone walls and the shut cottages, and the bare pegs in the empty school, and the whitewashed room where the singing had been, until there was nothing left of the valley floor to see but the wide pale sheet lying still between the mountains. And if you had come to that place in the first days after the filling, not knowing, you would not have guessed that there had ever been anything beneath it at all. For the water kept its own smooth surface over the drowned village the way a coverlet is drawn smooth over a bed. And the mountains stood around it exactly as they had always stood, patient and rounded and green-brown in the changing light, and the whole broad bowl of the hills held the new lake the way a hand holds a bowl of still milk, and it was in its way a beautiful thing to look upon, which is one of the small hard truths of this story, and one I will not keep from you, that the thing they made was not ugly, that Celyn lying under a violet dusk with the mist gathering pale along its edges is as lovely as any lake in Wales, and that the loveliness of it and the sorrow of it are folded into one another now and cannot be pulled apart, and you need not try to pull them apart tonight. You may let them lie together in your mind the way they lie together in the valley, the beauty and the grief resting quietly side by side, and neither one of them asking anything of you but that you look, and remember, and be at peace. But before the water had quite finished its slow work, before the lake had settled fully into itself, there was to be one more day appointed for that valley, one last gathering of people upon its changed ground, and it is a strange day, and in its own way a comforting one, and I want to tell it to you gently now, because it is the day the world came to say that the thing was done, and found that it could not say it. They chose the 21st of October in the year 1965 for the opening of the reservoir, the formal ceremony, the ribbon cutting of it. The day the Liverpool Corporation would stand upon the shore of the new lake it had made in the Welsh mountains, and declare the great work finished, and hand it over into use. And they built for it the things such days are always built of, a raised wooden platform down beside the water with rows of chairs upon it, a marquee, a tent of canvas set up against the weather with its ropes pegged into the soft new ground, a microphone and a set of loudspeakers rigged up so that the speeches might carry out across the crowd, bunting perhaps, an order of proceedings printed on paper, the aldermen and the officials of Liverpool come down in their good dark coats and their chains of office, the engineers who had raised the dam, the dignitaries, all of them gathered on that platform in their appointed rows to mark with proper civic ceremony the completion of the scheme, to be photographed, to be congratulated, to say the measured public words that are said on such days about progress and supply and the meeting of the city's needs. And over all of it, that morning, there came down the cold Welsh rain. You will know the kind, or if you do not, you may imagine it easily enough, the fine grey rain of the mountains that is not so much a falling as a hanging in the air, that comes in off the peaks in slow wet sheets and soaks everything through by degrees without ever seeming to fall hard at all, that beads on the shoulders of good dark coats, and runs off the brims of hats, and lies grey over the whole valley, so that the mountains go soft and dim behind it, and the surface of the new lake is pocked all over with it. And it fell that day on the platform, and on the marquee, and on the rows of chairs, and on the officials in their places, a cold, steady, indifferent Welsh rain, as though the sky over Tryweryn had its own quiet opinion of the proceedings, and meant to make it plain. But it was not the rain that undid the day. What undid the day was the people. For they came, you see, They came down out of the hills and along the mountain roads and up from the towns of the valleys. They came in their hundreds, and by some tellings in their thousands, the ordinary people of Wales, come to that lonely shore, not to celebrate, but to stand in witness, and in grief, and in a long, slow anger held very tightly in, and they gathered about the platform in the rain. A great crowd of them, wet and quiet and watchful, and there was no violence in them. I want you to understand that clearly, for it matters there was no riot in it and no brawling. It was not that kind of crowd. It was a crowd that had come to say by the plain fact of its standing there, in the wet, in its numbers, with its faces set, that this thing that was being opened had been taken and not given, and that the taking would not be blessed, and that whatever fine words the men on the platform had come to say, there were a great many Welsh people standing in the rain who did not agree to hear them said. And then the ceremony began, and it could not go on. The moment the first of the officials rose to speak, the crowd would not have it. They shouted him down, they sang, they turned their backs, they pressed in close about the platform in the rain with their placards and their voices, and the words that had been prepared could not be got out over the noise of the people who had lost the valley. And then, and this is the small sharp detail that the day is remembered by, the thing that makes it almost a kind of grim wet miracle, the wires were cut. Somewhere in the press of that crowd a hand reached the cables that ran to the microphone and the loudspeakers and cut them so that the whole apparatus of the ceremony, the amplifiers, the speeches, the carrying voice that was to have announced across the water that the work was complete and good, went dead all at once into silence, and the men on the platform stood there in the rain with their mouths moving and no sound coming out of the loudspeakers at all. No speech, no declaration, no triumph. Nothing but the cold rain falling and the crowd's own voices and the flat grey lake behind them. And there was nothing to be done. Within minutes, and it truly was only minutes, the whole thing collapsed in the space of a few wet minutes. The ceremony was abandoned. It simply could not be held. The officials were got down off the platform and hurried away to their cars through the crowd and the rain, and driven quickly out of the valley, and the platform stood empty in the wet with its rows of soaking chairs, and the great work of the Liverpool Corporation was declared open to no one at all, unspoken, unblessed, unheard, in the rain, on the shore of a lake that had drowned a village. And I find, and I hope you may find too, as you lie there in the dark, that there is a strange quiet comfort in that, a thing that eases the heart rather than hardening it, that when they came at last to dress the drowning up as a triumph and to say the smooth words over it, they could not. The valley would not let them. The people would not let them. There is a decency in the world that will not always be commanded, and it stood in the rain that day at Tryweryn, and cut the wires and would not be spoken over. And though it could not give the valley back, it saw to it that the valley did not go under to the sound of applause. It went under in silence and in honest grief, witnessed, mourned, and never once pretended to be a happy thing, and that is a truer sending off than any speech could have been, and you may rest a little easier for the knowing of it. And think, if you will, as you lie there, of what those men on the platform had come expecting, and of what they found. They had come, I think, expecting an ordinary civic afternoon, of the kind their sort had held 100 times before over 100 other schemes, a thing of polite hands clapped and photographs taken, and a good lunch after under the canvas out of the rain, the dull, comfortable ceremony of the powerful marking their own work well done, and they can hardly have imagined that a few miles of drowned valley and 48 shepherds and children could raise against them, on that cold shore, a silence so heavy and a crowd so unwilling that the whole practised machinery of the day, the rigged loudspeakers, the ordered chairs, the printed programme, the measured words, would simply fail in their hands and leave them standing wet and voiceless before a nation that would not be told its grief was progress. And there is, I will not deny it, a small clean satisfaction in that picture. The kind you may allow yourself once and then gently let go before it hardens. For we are not here tonight to nurse a grievance but to lay one down, so take the satisfaction lightly, the way you would take a warm stone into a cold hand, and let it warm you a moment, and set it aside, and go on. So let the officials go then, driven away up the wet road. Let the platform stand empty and be taken down. Let the last of the crowd turn from the shore and go quietly home into the hills. The water closed fully over Capel Celyn. The reservoir settled to its level. And here, in the ordinary run of such stories, is where the telling would end, with the loss complete and the ledger closed, the valley gone, and the city watered, and nothing more to say. And if that were all, it would be a sad and simple thing, and I would not have brought you all this long way to hear it. But it is not all, and I have promised you a grace, and told you the grace already at the very start of the night. And now I have come round at last to the place where I may give it to you properly. And I want to give it to you slowly, and not as anger, though there would be cause for anger, but as consequence, which is a quieter and a stronger thing. For the plain truth of what happened next is this, that the drowning of Capel Celyn did not stay in the valley of Tryweryn. It could not be kept there. It ran out along the roads and into the towns and up into the hearts of people who had never seen the valley and never would. And it settled into the conscience of a whole country, and it changed that country, and it is changing it still. For the people of Wales had watched the whole thing happen from beginning to end. They had watched a small, harmless, wholly Welsh-speaking village do every proper and peaceful and lawful thing that could be done, form its committee, march through the streets of Liverpool with its placards, petition, plead, send its case to Parliament. And they had watched nearly every Welsh voice in that Parliament raised against the scheme, and they had watched all of it count for nothing. Watched the valley drowned over the near-united objection of the nation it belonged to, because the deciding of it had been placed in hands that were not Welsh and would never live under the water, and a country may forgive a great many things, but it does not easily forget being shown, so plainly and so publicly, that its own settled will over its own green ground did not, in the end, weigh anything at all. Something woke in Wales over Tryweryn. It is one of those things that historians and the people themselves both say, in their different words, looking back, that the drowning of Capel Celyn was a turning, a place where a slow and scattered feeling gathered itself and hardened into a purpose, where a great many Welsh people who had never thought much about such matters found themselves thinking, quietly and then not so quietly, that a nation which could not keep its own valley from being taken must find some way to have a say over its own land, that the old arrangement whereby the fate of Welsh ground could be settled elsewhere by those who did not live upon it could not be allowed to stand, and that the language, the old unbroken tongue that had run through that valley like its river and had gone down under the water, with it, was a thing that must be defended now deliberately, by law, before more of it was lost. And out of that waking, in the years that followed, came real things, solid things, things you can point to. The loss of Tryweryn is woven all through the story of how modern Wales began to insist upon itself, how the cause of the Welsh language gathered its strength and won at last the protections of a Welsh Language Act, so that the tongue of Capel Celyn should have standing and shelter that it had never had before. And further on, in the fullness of years, that same long waking fed into the movement that carried Wales toward the governing of more of its own affairs, toward devolution, toward a Senedd, a parliament of its own at last, sitting in Cardiff, with its own say over its own land, the very thing whose absence had drowned the valley. I do not tell you these are simple things, or that a single flooded village made them alone. The story of a nation is never so tidy as that, and there were 100 currents running. But ask in Wales, and they will tell you, Tryweryn is in it. Tryweryn is one of the deep stones under the foundation of it. The valley they drowned because Wales had no say became one of the reasons Wales came to have a say, and there is a justice in that so slow and so large that you can rest your whole weary heart upon it, the way you would rest against a wall that has stood a long time and will go on standing. And there is one more thing that came out of the waking, a small thing and a plain one, and it is the third of the 3 warm stones I gave you to carry at the very beginning of this long night, and I want to set it now carefully into your keeping, for it is perhaps the gentlest guardian of the whole story. Somewhere far from the valley, over on the western coast of Wales near the little place of Llanrhystad, along the road that runs up beside the sea, there stood a low ruined wall, an ordinary broken dry stone wall by the roadside, the kind you would pass 1,000 times and never look at twice, and at some point in those years, in the aftermath of the drowning, someone came to that wall in the night with a brush and a tin of dull red paint, and painted across it in tall rough hand brushed capital letters 2 words. Cofiuch Drywarin. Remember Trywarin. That was all. 2 words on a broken wall by the sea, painted by a hand whose name hardly matters now, a small quiet act of refusal. A way of saying into the passing traffic and the salt wind that this thing that had been done must not be let to slide away and be forgotten, as the powerful always hope such things will slide away and be forgotten. And the strange and lovely thing, the thing that makes those 2 words a warm stone and not a cold one, is that they would not go away. The paint faded, and someone painted it again. The wall was defaced, and hands came and set it right. Year after year, decade after decade, through weather and through neglect, and through the coming and going of whole generations who had not been born when the valley went under, those 2 red words on that low wall were tended and guarded and kept, repainted whenever they dimmed, defended whenever they were harmed, until the wall was no longer just a wall but a thing the whole nation knew, a landmark, a place people slow their cars for, a shrine almost, standing on its lonely coast with the green hillside rising behind it and the 2 dull red words holding their watch. Cofiuch Drywarin, remember Trywarin, a whole valley's grief and a whole nation's promise carried in 2 words on a broken wall, kept alive by nothing but the plain will of ordinary people that it should be kept alive. You have those 2 words with you now, safe, one of the 3 you have carried faithfully all this long way, the bell and the slates, and the 2 red words on the wall, and they are all of them kept, and you have helped to keep them by the simple act of listening. And there was, in the end, one thing more, come very late, when almost all who had lived in the valley were old or gone, for in the year 2005, 40 years on from the drowning, the City Council of Liverpool did a thing that is rare enough among the powers of this world that it is worth the marking. It looked back at what had been done in its name in that Welsh valley, and it apologised. Formally, publicly, in plain words, the council set down its regret for the drowning of Capel Celyn, for the loss and the hurt of it, for the way it had been done, an apology that could not lift the water nor call back the village nor give the language its lost hearths, and that came, as such apologies so often come, long after it could mend anything, and yet an apology honestly meant and honestly given, an acknowledgment across 40 years, and a border that a wrong had been done to a small people and their small valley, and there is grace even in that, even in the lateness of it. For it is a better thing that it was said than that it was never said, and it let a little of the old bitterness go out of the story like breath let slowly out, and made it a fraction more possible for the 2 nations to look at that drowned ground together and grieve it in common rather than across a divide. So gather it all up now, gently, and hold it, and let it settle the way the water settled over the valley, smooth and level and at rest. They took the valley. That is true, and I have not softened it and will not. They took a whole small world of homes and fields and graves, and 1 whitewashed chapel, and 1 bell, and 1 room full of children's slates, and they drowned it under a lake to water a city that lay far off over the mountains and had never thought to ask, and every proper and peaceful thing the valley did to save itself came to nothing against the distance, and the power ranged over it. And that is a grief, and it is right that it should be grieved. But the valley, in the going under, did not vanish the way its takers might have wished. In drowning it spoke, more loudly than it had ever spoken while it lived. It cut the wires on its own false triumph, and would not be celebrated over. It woke the country that had let it be taken, and set that country on the long slow road toward keeping its own land and its own tongue, It left 2 red words upon a distant wall that a whole nation has refused for generations to let fade. And it drew from those who wronged it, at the last, the rare and human grace of an apology. They took the valley, and the valley changed the country that took it. And that is the truth I most want to leave lying warm in your mind as this long night begins at last to draw down toward its own quiet close. Not that loss is nothing, for loss is not nothing, but that a loss carried faithfully, remembered, refused the mercy of forgetting, can become a kind of slow root under everything that grows afterward, so that nothing that is truly grieved is ever wholly wasted. And now there is only the keeping left to tell, the last gentle turn of the whole night, the memorial chapel standing grey above the water with the bell and the pulpit, and the names of the drowned homes set safe within its walls, and the miracle of the low summers when the village itself comes back up out of the falling water into the light, but that is for the last of the telling. And there is no hurry to reach it, none at all, so let your breathing go long and slow now. And let the lake lie smooth and pale in your mind under its violet dusk, with the 2 red words keeping their far watch upon the coast, and rest a little while here, in the quiet after the drowning, in the country that woke, and let it hold you. And so we come, you and I, gently and without any hurry at all, to the last quiet stretch of the night, to the part of the story where nothing more is taken and nothing more is lost, where the water has done its slow work, and the anger has spent itself into the rain, and the years have folded over the whole of it, the way still water folds over a dropped stone. And all that is left for us to do now is the kindest thing, the thing this valley has been asking of the world ever since the day it went under, which is simply to keep it, to gather up its few saved and precious things and set them down somewhere safe and warm, and then to let ourselves rest. For that is where the story turns at the end, away from the drowning and back toward the keeping. And I want to walk you the rest of the way there slowly, in the soft violet and amber light of a Welsh evening, along the one mountain road that runs above the lake, so that you can see for yourself that the valley was never wholly lost, that its truest things were carried up out of the water in good time and are held to this day, and that a place can be drowned and still be kept, can be gone from the map and still be here, still able to come back up into the light whenever the summer runs dry. So let us go up the road above Celyn, in the last of the day, and let me show you where the 3 warm stones of this long night are kept now. The 3 things I asked you at the very beginning to carry with you all the way through, and let me set each of them down for you, safe, so that you need carry them no further. There is a small chapel that stands above the water, and I want to bring you to it first. It is not the old chapel. The old chapel is under the lake, its whitewashed walls and its dark box pews and its raised pulpit, all long since given to the deep water at the valley's heart. This is a newer chapel, a small and plain and honest little building of neat grey Welsh stone, set back just off the mountain road on the higher ground above the reservoir, with a low-arched gateway of stone leading in, and it was raised there deliberately, lovingly, out of the ruin of what was drowned, to be a place where the memory of Capel Celyn could go on having a roof over it and a door. That opens. And when you step in out of the wind, into the hush of it, you find that the valley did not go down empty-handed after all, that its dearest things came up the hill ahead of the water, and are here, waiting, kept. For here, inside these grey stone walls, is the pulpit, the very pulpit, the raised wooden preaching stand that stood in the old chapel down in the valley, from which the 4-part hymns were raised on 100 years of Sunday mornings, and the word was given out in the old tongue to the farmers and the shepherds and the schoolchildren of Capel Celyn. It was salvaged before the flooding, carried up out of the fold, and it stands here now, so that the voice of the place has somewhere still to stand. And here too, kept safe, is the bell. You remember the bell. The little aged bronze bell with its soft green-brown patina that hung in the modest bell-cote of the old chapel and rang the valley to worship across the water meadows on the Sabbath, and rang it too to grief and to gladness, to weddings and to burials, through all the ordinary years, the bell that was rung one last time in the empty valley. One last slow, careful peal over the doomed fold, before it was lifted down from its yoke and carried up the hill out of the reach of the rising lake. It did not go under, it was saved. And it hangs here still, in the memorial chapel above the water, this same small bell, and it can still be rung, and on the days of remembering it is rung, its old bronze voice going out once more over the valley, out over the wide pale sheet of the reservoir that lies now where its own belfry used to stand, calling across the water to a village that is no longer there, and yet somehow always is. So there is your first warm stone, and you may set it down now and let it rest. The bell is safe. The bell was carried up out of the valley before the water came, and it is kept, and it still speaks. It is not at the bottom of the lake. It is up here in the light, in the grey stone chapel by the road, and it will not be lost. Let that be a settled thing in you now, a small warm certainty you can lay your hand on in the dark. The bell is safe. And along the inner walls of this same small chapel, set carefully into the grey stone, are the plaques, the engraved stone name plates, and on them are cut the names, the plain names of the drowned homes and the people of Capel Celyn, each farmhouse and small holding of the valley named and kept, Hafod for dog and the rest of them, the dozen households that made up the whole of that small world, and the names of the families who lived and worked and worshipped there, all of it lettered now into stone that no water will ever reach, so that anyone who climbs the road and steps in out of the weather can stand and read them, slowly, one by one, and know that these were real people in a real place, that this was a home and not merely a valley, that here lived so-and-so and his family, and here another, and here the chapel, and here the school. The village has an address again, cut in stone, up above the lake. And that brings me to your second warm stone, and I would have you take it up now, and hold it a moment before you set it to, safely down, for it is the tenderest of the three. The slates. The children's slates, and the small Welsh names of the school children of Capel Celyn. You will remember the one-room school on the valley floor, the little stone schoolroom with its 2 tall windows and its cast-iron stove and its rows of small worn wooden desks, and the gentle schoolteacher in her dark navy dress and her soft grey cardigan, and the low coat pegs along the wall where the children hung their coats each morning, and the black writing slates and the squeak of the chalk, and the young voices reciting and singing their lessons in Welsh, in the old language, in a valley where the old language was still simply the language of every ordinary thing. That schoolroom is under the water. Its desks and its stove and its bare coat pegs went down with the rest of the fold. But the children did not go down. The children were led up out of the valley, every one of them, in good time before the flooding, and they grew, and they lived their lives, and they carried the valley in them wherever they went. And they carried the language, which is the deepest keeping of all, and some of them lived long enough to walk back down, in the dry years, over the cracked bed of the lake, and stand on the exact ground where their school had stood, and find themselves grown old above the place where they had once been small. And the names of those children, and the pattern of that little Welsh-speaking schoolroom, the very fact that such a place existed, that here in one narrow upland valley the whole of childhood ran unbroken in the old tongue, all of that is remembered now, written down, told and retold, held in the memorial and held in the histories and held, tonight, in you. So set your second stone down gently, and let it rest. The slates are remembered. The children were saved. The small names chalked up in that one-room school were not washed away. They were carried up the hill in living memory and set safe. And the language those children spoke did not drown with their desks. It went on. It is going on still. That is a thing you may believe as you lie there in the dark. The children got out, and the words they spoke got out with them, and both are kept. And now the third warm stone, the last of the three, and this one is not up by the lake at all, but far off, right across the country, on a quiet roadside near the sea, and yet it belongs here at the end with the other two, because it is the promise that holds all the rest together. the 2 words. You remember them. Painted long ago in tall rough hand brushed dull red capital letters across a low-ruined roadside wall of whitewashed stone, with the green Welsh hillside rising behind, 2 words and nothing else. Cofitch Dry Rain. Remember Try Rain. 2 words that somebody painted in grief and in defiance after the valley went under, on a broken wall by the road near Llanrhystad on the Cardiganshire coast, a good long way from the drowned fold itself, so that all of Wales driving that coast road would see them and be reminded. 2 words that could so easily have faded and flaked and washed away in a single hard Welsh winter and been forgotten like 1,000 other scrawls on 1,000 other walls. But they were not let fade. That is the whole quiet miracle of them. Year upon year, when the weather wore the paint thin, or when some hand tried to spoil them, other hands came quietly in the night and the morning, and painted them fresh again, kept the letters bold and red and legible, tended them the way you tend a grave, until those 2 rough words on that low broken wall became something far larger than paint, became a landmark, became a shrine, became the conscience of a country written on a stone by the road, and to this day they are kept, repainted, guarded, loved, and repeated now on walls and gable, ends the length and breadth of Wales. Cofitch Dry Rain, remember Try Rain, remember the valley we let them take, so that it can never happen quietly again. So there is your 3rd warm stone, and you may lay it down beside the other 2 and rest. The 2 words are still watching. They did not fade. They are kept red and bold on the wall by the sea, and they are painted now in 100 places besides, and they are a promise the whole country has agreed to keep, that the drowned valley will be remembered. The bell is safe. The slates are remembered. The 2 words are still watching. All 3 of the warm stones I gave you at the start of this long night are set down now, safe, kept, and you need carry them no further. You may let your hands go loose and empty in the dark, because the keeping does not depend on you staying awake. It is done. It is held. Others are holding it, in the grey chapel by the road and on the red-lettered wall by the sea. And they will go on holding it long after you have drifted off to sleep. And now, before I let you go all the way down into your rest, I want to give you the last and deepest grace of this whole story, the thing that turns it from a grief you must simply bear into a peace you can lie down inside, and it is this: the valley comes back. It really does. Capel Celyn is drowned, but Capel Celyn is not gone. Because a reservoir is not the sea, a reservoir rises and falls with the rain and the thirst of the year, and in the dry summers, in the long rainless spells when the water is drawn down and the level of Llyn Celyn sinks lower than anyone likes, the lake gives the valley back. Slowly, over days, as the pale water shrinks away from its edges, the drowned fold lifts once more into the light. First the tops of the old dry stone field walls break the surface, dark and dripping, the very walls the farmers built stone by stone over generations, running their old straight lines down the slope exactly where they always ran, and then more of them, and then the ground between them, the cracked pale mud of the exposed lake bed drying in the warm level summer sun, and then, rising up out of the shrinking water into the amber evening, the low broken footings of the old stone bridge that once carried the road across the young Afon Try Rain, its pale arch stumps standing again above the mud, and the bleached bare stumps of trees that grew in the valley before it was flooded, and, faint but unmistakable to anyone who knows where to look, the rectangular foundation lines of the cottages and the small holdings, and, at the heart of it, the plain oblong footprint of the chapel and the school, the ground plan of a whole village drawn back up out of the deep in the low gold light, as though the valley had only been holding its breath all these years under water, and had for a little while let it out again. And people come. That is the tender heart of it. When the word goes round that Try Rain is low, that Capel Celyn is rising, people come, and they walk down off the mountain road and out across the cracked and drying bed of the lake, out over ground that spends most of its years beneath cold fathoms of still water, and they stand among the low walls, and they find the bridge, and they trace with their eyes the outline of the chapel. and the old ones among them who were children here point and say, quietly, in Welsh, here was our house, here was the school, here was where the road ran, and here was the chapel, and for a few warm, dry days the drowned village is a village again, walked in, spoken of, remembered on its own ground, before the rains return and the water rises and closes over it once more, gently, until the next dry year calls it back up into the day. And there is something in that, I think, that is worth carrying down into your sleep like a small warm coal. Something the people who plotted the drowning of this valley never once imagined, and could never have prevented, which is that a place loved as deeply as Capel was loved does not stay under. They meant it to be gone, finally and forever, one clean sheet of water over the whole of it, out of sight and soon enough out of mind, and instead they made a lake that opens like a hand every dry summer and offers the village back up into the sun, walls and bridge and hearthstones and all, for the old ones to walk into and the young ones to learn from, so that a child born long after the flooding can be brought down over the cracked mud on a hot still evening and shown this was real, this was here, this happened, and can lay a hand on the actual stone of an actual wall that men built with their actual hands in a valley that spoke. In every corner of every ordinary day, the oldest living language in this whole island, you cannot drown a thing like that. You can put water over it, but you cannot drown it. So you see, it is not a story of something simply put under and lost forever. It is a story of something put under that keeps coming back, that cannot quite be held down, that the very lake built to erase it hands back, faithfully, every time the summer runs dry, as if even the water cannot bring itself to keep the valley forever. Drowned, but never wholly gone, under, but always able to rise. That is the plain and settled truth of Capel Celyn, and I will lay it down for you now in the simplest words I have, so that you can hold the whole shape of it in one quiet thought as you go down into sleep. Here was a valley, a small green Welsh valley far up in the mountains, with a chapel and a school and a dozen farms and 48 souls, and a whole living pocket of the old language, and it was taken. It was taken from far off, by people who did not live in it and would never see it, decided by a distant parliament through a private act that shut the door on every Welsh objection. Taken though the village did every peaceful and lawful and dignified thing a village could do to be spared, taken though nearly every Welsh voice that had a vote cried out against it, taken and drowned to send water to a great city that had, in the deepest sense, never thought to ask. And it was lied to by distance and by power, told in effect that its worth was less than a reservoir, that its language and its dead and its Sunday hymns and its children's slates could all be weighed against a city's convenience and found wanting. All of that is true, and I have not softened it, and I will not soften it now. But here is the other half of the truth, the half that lets you sleep. That valley outlived its own drowning. It went under the water, and in going under it woke the country that had let it be taken. Its loss passed into the conscience of a whole nation and would not leave. It strengthened, more than almost anything else in that century, the plain conviction that Wales must have a say over its own ground and its own tongue, and it fed the long, slow movement that ran on through the years toward protection. For the Welsh language and, in time, toward Wales winning back a measure of the say over its own affairs that it had so bitterly lacked the day the Tryweryn Bill was passed over its head. The valley that was told it did not matter turned out to matter more, in the end, than almost any valley in Wales, because its drowning changed the country. And it is kept now, on every side. It is kept by the memorial chapel above the water, with its salvaged pulpit and its saved bell and its names cut in stone. It is kept by the language it helped to save, still spoken, still sung, still taught to children. It is kept by the 2 red words on the wall by the sea, tended and repainted and repeated across the land. And it is kept by the lake itself, that strange faithful lake, that gives the whole village back into the light every dry summer, as though it could not bear to be the thing that erased it. A valley taken and lost and lied to, that outlived its own drowning, that turned its loss into the waking of a nation, and that is kept. That is the story. That is the whole of it. And you have carried it now, all the way, from the high wet moorland where the river gathers, down into the warm full valley in its best years, through the coming of the distant decision and the long dignified fight that changed nothing and mattered enormously, through the tender terrible years of the taking, the graves lifted to higher ground, the last hymn. The last peal of the bell, the water climbing the dry stone walls in the dusk, through the rain-soaked ceremony that could not be made to look like a triumph, and the two words that appeared on the wall and would not fade, and now, at the last, up the mountain road to where the bell and the pulpit and the names are kept safe and dry, and down again over the cracked lake bed of a dry summer to stand among the risen walls of a village that will not stay drowned. You have carried the valley faithfully, the whole long way, and there is nothing left now for you to do, because everything that this story ever asked of anyone has already, quietly, been done. The names are safe on the wall, the bell is safe in the chapel, the children got out, and the language got out with them. The village is kept, on the road, and on the wall, and in the lake, and, tonight, in you. And that keeping, that faithful remembering, was the only thing this valley ever truly asked of the world. Not vengeance, not undrowning, not the water rolled back and the walls raised up, and the 48 souls set living again in their farms. None of that, for that could never be, only this, only to be remembered a while, only not to be let slip quietly and completely under the water as though it had never been. And you have done that, simply by staying with me through this long gentle night, by letting the valley and its people and its chapel and its bell and its bright-eyed schoolchildren live again for these few hours in the warm fire-lit room of your listening. You have done the one thing that was ever needed. You have remembered Tryweryn. Cofiuch Tryweryn, the wall says, remember Tryweryn, and tonight, without lifting a hand, without staying awake one moment longer than your own weary eyes allow, you have helped to keep that promise. You have added your quiet remembering to all the other quiet rememberings that hold this valley safe above the reach of forgetting. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. So let it all go now. Let the story set itself down, whole and finished and safe, the way the bell was set down safe in the chapel above the water. You do not need to hold any of it any longer, it is held. The still pale water of Celyn lies quiet in its broad bowl of rounded mountains, holding the last violet and amber light of the evening on its surface, the way it has held it every calm dusk for 60 years. And the drowned walls wait patiently beneath it for the next dry summer to call them up, and the little bell hangs silent and safe in the grey stone chapel by the road, and the two red words keep their long watch on the wall by the sea, and the great treeless Welsh mountains stand all around in the falling light and keep, as they have always kept, their long slow faith with the valley in their arms. There is nothing here to fear, and nothing here to fix, and nothing at all now to keep you from your rest. The valley is remembered, the promise is kept, the light lies gentle on the water. Let your breathing go long and slow, and let the mountains hold the watch tonight, for they are far better at it than we are, and they never tire. And let the still water hold the last of the light, and let it all of it, go. Sleep now. Sleep and rest, and be at peace. The valley is kept, and so are you. Nostar. Good night.